What if I told you the Pentagon once submitted formal plans to bomb American cities and blame it on Cuba? That a general signed off on sinking refugee boats in Florida waters to justify invasion? In March 1962, the Joint Chiefs presented Operation Northwoods to the Secretary of Defense. Real American casualties, fabricated evidence, engineered outrage. It wasn't rejected because it was immoral. It was rejected because it wasn't necessary yet. If you're new here, subscribe. We're diving into the archives they hoped you'd never read. Get comfortable, pour something warm, settle in for the night. By August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin had become a stage for something that never happened. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara stood before Congress presenting radar intercepts and sonar reports as evidence of North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacking the Usmatics. The Senate voted 88-2 for war authorization. Except the attack on August 4th, the one that justified escalation, was a ghost. Sailors reported torpedoes that weren't there. Sonar operators heard phantom echoes. One destroyer captain radioed back, "Review of action makes many reported contacts appear doubtful." The NSA's own declassified documents, released quietly in 2005, confirmed the second attack was misidentified radar, bad weather, and operational anxiety projected onto empty ocean. McNamara knew the intelligence was shaky within days. He testified anyway. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed. Within a year, 180,000 American troops deployed to Vietnam. In the lamplight offices where decisions were made, certainty was more useful than truth. While Americans watched newsreels of Soviet ships turning back from Cuba in October 1962, another deal was being cut in private. President Kennedy had positioned Jupiter missiles in Turkey, aimed at Soviet cities, months before the Cuban crisis erupted. When Soviet Premier Khrushchev demanded their removal, Kennedy publicly refused, then quietly agreed. The XCOM recordings, declassified decades later, reveal Attorney General Robert Kennedy meeting Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin in secret, promising the Turkish missiles would be withdrawn within months if the Soviets kept the concession confidential. The public story celebrated American resolve. The private reality was a trade: Soviet missiles out of Cuba, American missiles out of Turkey, and both sides claiming victory. The Jupiter missiles disappeared from Turkey by April 1963. The agreement stayed secret for years. It's the kind of resolution that should have been taught in every classroom. Technically, it was classified instead. The story begins with smoke rising over Columbus, New Mexico, in March 1916. Pancho Villa's forces allegedly crossed the border, killed 17 Americans, and torched the town in retaliation for U.S. support of his rivals. General John Pershing led a punitive expedition into Mexico with 10,000 troops, chasing Villa for 11 months across harsh terrain. But War Department cables, later examined by historians, suggest the raid's scale and motive were exaggerated to justify intervention. Some accounts claim Villa's men did attack, but were provoked by American arms dealers backing his enemies. Other evidence points to local bandits, not Villa's organized forces. What's documented? Pershing never caught Villa. The expedition inflamed U.S.-Mexico tensions and nearly triggered full-scale war when American troops clashed with Mexican federal forces at Carrizal. The official narrative framed Villa as the aggressor. The diplomatic reality showed two governments on the brink of conflict over an incident neither fully controlled. Pershing withdrew in early 1917, just in time for World War I. The intervention left no resolution, just a precedent for crossing borders when the story was convenient. February 1898, Havana Harbor. The Maine exploded, killing 266 sailors. Within days, William Randolph Hearst newspapers screamed Spanish treachery. And remember the Maine. Circulation records show Hearst papers sold over 1 million copies daily during the crisis, capitalizing on war fever. A U.S. naval inquiry blamed a mine. Later investigations, including a 1976 Admiral Hyman Rickover study, suggested the explosion originated inside the ship, a coal bunker fire igniting ammunition stores, a common hazard of the era. But nuance doesn't sell papers. Hearst reportedly told his illustrator in Cuba, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." Whether he actually said it remains disputed, but the sentiment captured the moment. President McKinley, pressured by public outrage and political hawks, asked Congress for authority to intervene. The Spanish-American War began in April. Spain's empire crumbled. America gained Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. In the marble hallways of power, the truth about the Maine mattered less than the momentum it created. The Mexican-American War started with a border nobody agreed on. In August 1846, President James Polk claimed Mexican forces attacked American troops on U.S. soil along the Rio Grande. Congressional investigation testimony later revealed the attack happened in disputed territory both nations claimed. Polk had ordered General Zachary Taylor to advance into the contested zone, effectively provoking confrontation. Abraham Lincoln, then a freshman congressman, introduced his spot resolutions, demanding Polk identify the exact spot where American blood was shed on American soil. Polk never answered. The House questioned the war's legitimacy, but by then, American forces occupied Mexico City. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo transferred half of Mexico's territory to the United States, California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Historians still debate whether the initial clash was Mexican aggression or American entrapment. What's certain, Polk wanted war, created conditions for it, and got a continent-spanning empire in return. In the official record, it was self-defense. In the documented timeline, it was choreographed expansion. By February 1899, American forces occupied Manila after Spain ceded the Philippines. The Filipinos, who'd fought for independence, expected freedom. Instead, General Elmer Otis announced American sovereignty. When Filipino forces resisted, the U.S. framed it as unprovoked rebellion. Army after action reports describe a staged incident. An American private shot a Filipino soldier crossing a bridge into the American zone under unclear circumstances. The shooting triggered a firefight that became the Philippine-American War's opening battle. Historians examining the reports found conflicting accounts. Some claim the Filipino fired first. Others suggested American troops were ordered to provoke conflict. What followed was a brutal 3-year war. 4,200 American dead, over 20,000 Filipino combatants killed, and an estimated 200,000 civilian fatalities from violence, famine, and disease. Mark Twain called it our ongoing war against the innocent. The war ended with American colonial rule lasting until 1946. The opening shot remains debated. The annexation was always the plan. In 1801, President Thomas Jefferson faced a problem off North Africa's coast. Barbary pirates demanded tribute for safe passage of American merchant ships. Jefferson, ideologically opposed to paying bribes, sought congressional authorization for military action. Naval correspondence from the period shows the pirate threat was real but manageable. European powers had negotiated treaties for decades. Jefferson amplified the danger, framing it as intolerable extortion threatening American sovereignty. Congress authorized limited naval force. What started as a punitive expedition became the First Barbary War, lasting 4 years and establishing U.S. naval presence in the Mediterranean. The war ended with a treaty and a continued, smaller tribute payment, the very thing Jefferson claimed he wouldn't do. The military action, however, set a precedent. American warships could project power far from home. The threat was genuine. The scale of response created something larger, a rationale for permanent naval expansion. Tribute payments quietly continued until 1815. The principle of American force was established far earlier. By 1912, Nicaragua was a mess of American business interests and unstable governments. Secretary of State Philander Knox, backed by banking interests, prepared contingency plans for military occupation to secure a proposed canal route and protect American loans. State Department memo caches, declassified in the 1970s, revealed detailed invasion logistics, troop numbers, landing sites, and governance structures for prolonged occupation. The canal was never built. Panama's route proved more viable, but the military intervention went ahead anyway. Marines landed in August 1912, ostensibly to protect American lives during a civil war. They stayed for 13 years. The occupation installed friendly governments, trained a National Guard that later became a dictatorial force, and established financial controls that directed Nicaragua's economy toward American creditors. The blueprint wasn't spontaneous crisis response, it was premeditated regime management. Knox left office in 1913. The occupation he designed lasted until 1925, paused briefly, then resumed from 1926 to 1933. The documents showed what the speeches concealed: intervention as business plan, sovereignty as negotiable asset. In mahogany paneled offices, Nicaragua's future was a balance sheet. The year was 1867, and Secretary of State William Seward was on a buying spree. Fresh off purchasing Alaska from Russia, he approached Denmark with an offer for Greenland. Congressional appropriations hearings later revealed Seward's lobbying for funds to acquire the island, framing it as strategic positioning against European powers. Denmark declined. Greenland wasn't for sale, but the proposal reflected American ambitions for Arctic territory. Seward argued Greenland's resources and location justified acquisition. Critics called it imperial overreach disguised as manifest destiny. The plan died quietly, but the appetite for northern expansion didn't. During World War II, the U.S. established military bases in Greenland with Danish permission, bases that remain operational today. The 1867 offer became a historical footnote, but it exposed a pattern: American interest in territories framed as purchases, backed by implicit force if negotiation failed. Denmark's refusal was polite. The strategic reality, American bases operating on Greenland soil 75 years later, suggested the outcome was always going to favor geography over sovereignty. In the 1920s and early 1930s, the U.S. Army War College developed War Plan Red, a detailed strategy for invading Canada and fighting the British Empire. Declassified strategic documents from the National Archives reveal logistics for seizing Halifax, Montreal, and Vancouver, disrupting the Welland Canal, and occupying Quebec. The plan assumed Britain would be the aggressor in a future conflict, perhaps over trade disputes or Caribbean territories. It wasn't paranoia. Britain had similar plans for defending against American invasion. Both nations wargamed scenarios where the unthinkable became operational. The plans included poison gas deployment, strategic bombing of industrial centers, and naval blockades. War Plan Red was updated regularly until 1939, when the rise of Nazi Germany shifted both nations toward alliance. The documents are startling not because war was imminent, it wasn't, but because it was considered plausible enough to meticulously plan. In hushed military academies, staff officers plotted the conquest of the world's largest undefended border. The plans gathered dust in filing cabinets, filed under Commonwealth contingencies. Anglo-American friendship, it turned out, was a choice renewed annually in those quiet rooms, where maps covered walls and borders were just lines waiting to be redrawn. Port-au-Prince, 1915. Haiti's government was unstable, its debts to American and European banks mounting. Admiral William Caperton received orders to land Marines, ostensibly to restore order after the assassination of Haiti's president. The pretext was chaos. The motive, revealed in the Senate investigation of 1921, was securing the customs house, Haiti's primary revenue source, for American creditors. The Marines seized the National Bank's gold reserves, physically transporting $500,000 to New York for safekeeping. A new Haitian constitution, written under American supervision, allowed foreign ownership of land, previously prohibited. The occupation lasted 19 years. During that time, forced labor built roads, thousands died in uprisings against American rule, and Haiti's sovereignty existed only on paper. Senator William King's committee documented the operation as financial imperialism enforced at gunpoint. The customs revenue went to American banks. Haitian presidents served at American pleasure. When the Marines finally withdrew in 1934, they left behind a trained military force that would dominate Haitian politics for decades. The official story called it stabilization. The financial records called it collateral management. In 1957, Yemen's Aden Protectorate teetered on the edge of British colonial control and rising Arab nationalism. CIA station chiefs in the region, according to declassified National Security Council minutes, drafted plans for American intervention to prevent Soviet influence from spreading through the Suez Crisis fallout. The proposal involved supporting anti-communist factions with arms, advisors, and, if necessary, direct military action. President Eisenhower reviewed the plans but ultimately declined, prioritizing the Middle East's oil-producing states over Yemen's strategic but resource-poor position. The intervention never happened. British forces handled the colonial unrest until Yemen's revolution in the 1960s created a proxy war between Egyptian and Saudi forces, with the U.S. indirectly supporting the Saudis. The 1957 plans, shelved and forgotten, revealed a pattern. Intervention was always on the table, waiting for the right crisis or the wrong president. In leather-bound briefing books, Yemen existed as a potential theater, its sovereignty conditional on Cold War calculations. The operation didn't proceed, the planning did. That distinction mattered less than you'd think. Guatemala City, 1954. The Eisenhower administration faced a problem. Guatemala's democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, planned to nationalize unused land owned by the United Fruit Company, compensating the company at the value it had declared for tax purposes. United Fruit, which had deep ties to the Dulles brothers, CIA Director Allen and Secretary of State John Foster, appealed for help. Operation PB Success, documented in declassified files, was the CIA's answer, a coup disguised as internal rebellion. The agency trained Guatemalan exiles in Honduras, provided arms and air support, and ran a psychological warfare campaign via radio broadcasts claiming massive rebel forces were advancing. The actual invasion force numbered about 480 men. Arbenz, believing American intervention was imminent and fearing a full military confrontation, resigned. The CIA installed Carlos Castillo Armas, who reversed land reforms and returned United Fruit's property. Guatemala descended into decades of civil war and military dictatorship, with over 200,000 killed. The operation cost the CIA about $20 million. United Fruit kept its land. Eisenhower called it a successful anti-communist intervention. Guatemalans called it the death of their democracy. In air-conditioned conference rooms in Langley, success metrics were measured in corporate assets secured, not lives preserved. Rio de Janeiro, 1964. Brazil's President João Goulart proposed land reform, nationalization of oil refineries, and policies alarming to American business interests and Cold War strategists. Ambassador Lincoln Gordon, in cables declassified years later, coordinated with CIA operatives and Brazilian military leaders, preparing to overthrow Goulart. The U.S. positioned a naval task force off Brazil's coast, Operation Brother Sam, ready to provide arms, fuel, and if necessary, direct support to coup plotters. On March 31, 1964, Brazilian generals moved against Goulart, who fled into exile. The expected resistance never materialized. American ships stayed offshore, unused but ready. Gordon immediately recognized the new military government. Declassified documents show the coup had U.S. approval at the highest levels, with President Johnson informed and supportive. Brazil's military ruled until 1985, a period marked by torture, censorship, and thousands of political prisoners. The naval task force sailed home quietly. The operation achieved its goal without firing a shot. In secure communications rooms, the Brazil model became a template. Support the generals, position the force, let the locals do the work, maintain plausible deniability. It was regime change as technical support. Santo Domingo, 1965. The Dominican Republic's civil war pitted military factions against each other after the 1963 coup that overthrew elected President Juan Bosch. When Bosch's supporters tried to restore constitutional government, President Lyndon Johnson saw communist infiltration. Nest deliberation transcripts show Johnson's advisors debating intervention within hours of fighting breaking out. Johnson ordered 42,000 troops to the Dominican Republic, the largest U.S. military operation since Korea, officially to evacuate American citizens. The troops stayed for over a year, ensuring a pro-American government took power. The intervention violated the OAS Charter. The justification, preventing another Cuba, was delivered with confidence, backed by thin intelligence. Investigators later found the communist threat vastly overstated. As one NC participant noted in his memoir, "We were more afraid of the example than the reality." Elections were held in 1966, under occupation, producing the outcome Washington preferred. The Marines left. The precedent stayed. Hemispheric democracy was negotiable if the results looked suspicious. In late-night phone calls captured on White House recordings, Johnson sounded less like a defender of freedom than a man terrified of losing control. Sitka, Alaska, 1867. Russia agreed to sell Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million, but the transfer almost sparked conflict with Britain over the boundary with British Columbia. The treaty ratification debates in Congress revealed deep concerns about overlapping territorial claims and Russian naval presence complicating withdrawal. Russian Admiral Konstantin Posyet supervised the handover, but his ships lingered, creating tension with British forces monitoring the region. Some senators feared the purchase would entangle the U.S. in Arctic disputes with Britain, still resentful over Civil War tensions when Britain had favored the Confederacy. The sale went through, but surveying the Alaska-Canada border took decades and nearly triggered confrontations between American and Canadian prospectors during the Klondike Gold Rush of the 1890s. The boundary wasn't fully settled until 1903 arbitration. Secretary of State William Seward, who negotiated the purchase, called it his greatest achievement. Critics called it Seward's folly and worried it was a geopolitical trap. The folly became fortune when gold was discovered. The trap was the assumption that buying land from one empire wouldn't offend another. In wood-paneled Senate chambers, the vote was close. In frozen Alaskan harbors, the sovereignty question remained open for 30 more years. New Orleans, 1803. President Thomas Jefferson needed the port for American commerce, but France controlled it. Napoleon, desperate for cash to fund European wars, offered to sell not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana territory. Jefferson had no constitutional authority for such a purchase, and worried France might reverse the offer. General James Wilkinson, later revealed to be a Spanish spy, which adds a layer of absurdity, prepared War Department orders for military occupation if negotiations failed. The plan was straightforward. If France refused to sell, American forces would seize New Orleans and deal with consequences later. Napoleon sold quickly, and the Louisiana Purchase doubled U.S. territory without a shot fired. But the military orders remained filed in War Department archives, showing the administration's readiness to take by force what it hoped to buy with money. Wilkinson's dual loyalties weren't discovered until years later, meaning America's backup invasion plan was prepared by someone simultaneously working for Spain. Jefferson's constitutional concerns evaporated when the deal closed. The contingency plans stayed quiet. In dim offices along the Potomac, expansion was destiny, payment was merely preferred method. The Oregon Territory, 1846. Britain and the United States both claimed the Pacific Northwest, with American expansionists demanding the border be set at 5440 north latitude, most of present-day British Columbia. President James Polk campaigned on the slogan 5440 or fight. Congressional speeches from the period are full of war rhetoric and manifest destiny flourishes. British forces in the region prepared for confrontation. Polk, however, was bluffing. He wanted Oregon, but was already maneuvering toward war with Mexico and couldn't fight Britain simultaneously. Negotiations resulted in the 49th Parallel Compromise, modern U.S.-Canada border, which gave the U.S. most of Oregon and Washington while Britain kept Vancouver Island and navigation rights on the Columbia River. The settlement was pragmatic, but it came dangerously close to conflict. British naval forces had mobilized, American settlers were armed and aggressive. One miscalculation could have meant war with the world's dominant naval power, while American troops headed toward Mexico City. Polk got his compromise and his war with Mexico. The fight part of his slogan evaporated quietly. In treaty negotiation rooms, the loud diplomacy concealed the careful math, one war at a time, preferably the winnable one. Apia, Samoa, 1899. Three nations, the United States, Britain, and Germany, all claimed influence over the Samoan Islands, installing rival kings and stationing warships in the harbor. A German naval commander, preparing to bombard rivals' positions, escalated tensions to the brink of a three-way colonial war. Treaty conference records showed diplomats scrambling to prevent military action while their navies glared at each other across Apia's harbor. A massive typhoon in 1889 had already destroyed 6 warships from all 3 nations, a natural disaster that temporarily cooled tensions by literally sinking the problem. But by 1899, the colonial competition resumed. The tripartite convention divided Samoa. Germany took the Western Islands. The U.S. took the Eastern Islands. American, and Britain received other Pacific concessions. The agreement narrowly avoided combat, but it revealed how quickly imperial competition could turn violent over islands most Americans couldn't locate on a map. The partition satisfied no one except the diplomats who avoided war. In Apia's harbor, the typhoon had been the only honest negotiator. It treated all empires equally. In conference rooms in Berlin, Washington, and London, Samoa was a bargaining chip in a larger game of Pacific influence that would shape the next century. La Guaira, Venezuela, 1902. European banks had loaned Venezuela money. Venezuela stopped paying. Britain and Germany sent warships to blockade Venezuelan ports and seize customs revenues by force. President Theodore Roosevelt, citing the Monroe Doctrine, opposed European military intervention in the Western Hemisphere. A British admiral coordinated the blockade while Roosevelt privately warned that American tolerance had limits. Declassified documents related to the Roosevelt corollary show TR drafting aggressive responses, positioning U.S. naval forces, and preparing for confrontation if Europeans landed troops or annexed territory. The crisis was resolved through arbitration at The Hague, but Roosevelt's handling established a precedent. European powers could no longer use military force to collect debts in the Americas. The Roosevelt corollary formalized this. The U.S. would intervene itself to prevent European intervention, making America the hemisphere's enforcer and debt collector. Venezuela kept its sovereignty technically. Roosevelt kept European powers at bay. American interventions in the Caribbean and Central America multiplied over the next 3 decades, always justified by the corollary Roosevelt crafted during the Venezuelan crisis. In hushed diplomatic cables, the message was clear. The hemisphere had a new manager, and payment plans would be renegotiated under new terms. Tangier, 1906. France and Germany clashed over influence in Morocco, and the dispute threatened European war. Theodore Roosevelt, despite American neutrality, played mediator at the Algeciras Conference. State Department cables from the period reveal Roosevelt's dual role, publicly impartial, privately pro-French, and strategically concerned that European war would destabilize Atlantic trade and force American involvement. The conference settled Morocco's status as a French protectorate, with Germany receiving minor economic concessions. Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, but the cables show he positioned American delegates to support France's position while maintaining the appearance of neutrality. The risk was significant. If the conference failed, war between major powers could erupt, potentially dragging in the United States. Roosevelt's intervention worked. but it set a precedent for American involvement in European disputes that would culminate in World War I a decade later. The conference resolved Morocco. It didn't resolve the Franco-German rivalry, which would explode in 1914. Roosevelt's diplomacy bought time, not peace. In elegant conference halls, the deals that prevented immediate war planted seeds for larger ones. Reykjavik, Iceland, 1941. Officially neutral, Iceland was strategically vital. Control of the island meant control of Atlantic shipping lanes. Admiral Ernest King and the Joint Chiefs reviewed planning documents for U.S. occupation to prevent Nazi Germany from seizing Iceland first. Britain had already occupied Iceland in May 1940, despite Icelandic protests, to prevent German use of the island. By 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed American forces would relieve British troops, allowing Britain to redeploy forces elsewhere. The occupation was framed as protecting Iceland, but planning documents show it was about denying Germany a submarine and air base that could strangle Allied supply lines. American forces landed in July 1941, 5 months before Pearl Harbor, making Iceland the first major U.S. military deployment in the European theater. Iceland's government accepted under protest, understanding the alternative was German occupation. The operation was invasion disguised as protection. Icelandic sovereignty evaporated under strategic necessity. American forces stayed until 1946, and the U.S. maintained a military presence at Keflavik until 2006. The original occupation documents reveal Roosevelt's willingness to violate neutrality preemptively, justified by the greater threat. In war rooms mapping the Atlantic, Iceland wasn't a nation, it was an airstrip. Waiting to be claimed. Tempelhof Airport, Berlin, 1948. The Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, cutting off road and rail access, trying to starve the city into submission. General Lucius Clay, military governor of the U.S. occupation zone, requested authorization to force ground convoys through Soviet checkpoints with armed escorts. Declassified documents show Clay's shoot-down authorization requests. If Soviet forces fired on supply trucks, American forces would return fire, likely triggering wider war. President Truman rejected the ground option and chose the airlift instead. C-47 cargo planes flying around the clock, landing every few minutes, delivering food, coal, and supplies. For 11 months, the airlift sustained 2 million Berliners. Soviet fighters could have shot down the cargo planes, and some American pilots prepared for exactly that. It didn't happen. Stalin lifted the blockade in May 1949, and the airlift succeeded without combat, but Clay's authorization requests reveal how close Berlin came to becoming a shooting war. One downed aircraft, one miscalculated response, and the Cold War goes hot in 1948 instead of staying frozen for 4 decades. In control towers across divided Berlin, every landing was a negotiation between necessity and catastrophe. The airlift became legend. The contingency plans for armed convoys stayed classified for decades, showing how thin the line was between historic triumph and unthinkable escalation. By 1953, Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, threatening British petroleum interests and alarming Washington about Soviet influence. Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of Theodore Roosevelt and CIA operative, orchestrated Operation Ajax, a coup disguised as popular uprising. Declassified contingency files reveal the operation included military invasion plans if the coup failed. The CIA coordinated with Iranian military officers, bribed politicians and journalists, and staged protests that appeared spontaneous. When the initial coup attempt faltered and the Shah fled to Rome, Roosevelt didn't abandon the operation. He doubled down, spending more money, recruiting more agents, and preparing for the possibility that American troops might be needed to secure oil fields if complete chaos erupted. The second attempt succeeded. The Shah returned. Mossadegh was arrested and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Iran's oil industry was restructured to benefit American and British companies. The invasion plans stayed filed away, unused but ready. 26 years later, The Iranian Revolution would cite the 1953 coup as proof of American imperialism. In the CIA's Tehran station, success was measured in barrels per day and regime stability, not in whether Iranians got to choose their government. The contingency army never deployed. The precedent of regime change on demand became standard practice. Sumatra, 1958. Indonesia's President Sukarno leaned toward non-alignment and socialism, unacceptable positions during the Cold War. CIA Director Alan Dulles approved support for regional rebels trying to overthrow Sukarno's government. What was supposed to be a deniable operation went spectacularly public when a CIA pilot, Alan Pope, was shot down bombing government positions. Declassified air support records show the CIA provided B-26 bombers, pilots, and military advisors to Indonesian rebels. Pope's capture was a disaster. He carried identification, mission logs, and couldn't credibly deny American involvement. Sukarno displayed the wreckage and the pilot as proof of U.S. aggression. Eisenhower publicly denied any involvement. Privately, the operation was hastily shut down. Pope spent 4 years in Indonesian prison before being quietly released in 1962. The coup failed. American involvement was exposed. Sukarno remained in power until a 1965 military coup. This time, won. The U.S. supported more carefully, with better deniability. The lesson wasn't to stop interfering. The lesson was to avoid getting caught. In Langley conference rooms, the Indonesia debacle became a case study in operational security failures, not moral ones. Pope's plane wreckage sat in a Jakarta museum for decades. An unsubtle reminder that covert wars leave visible debris. Kham Province, 1959. As Chinese forces consolidated control over Tibet, the CIA saw an opportunity to harass Beijing and support the Dalai Lama's resistance. The Tibetan training program, documented in declassified files, involved training Tibetan guerrillas in Colorado, then dropping them back into Tibet with weapons, radios, and supplies via C-130 flights from bases in India and Pakistan. CIA case officers coordinated the operation, knowing it couldn't reverse Chinese control but hoping it would tie down Chinese troops and gather intelligence. The program lasted into the early 1970s, supporting thousands of guerrilla fighters in a losing war against overwhelming Chinese military superiority. The risk was significant. If American aircraft were shot down over Chinese territory, it could trigger direct military confrontation. The CIA gambled that China would avoid escalation. They were right, but the Tibetan fighters paid the price. As Chinese counterinsurgency intensified, resistance collapsed. The CIA quietly withdrew support in the early 1970s as Tente with China took priority. The Dalai Lama fled to India. Tibetan independence became a lost cause. In CIA training facilities in the Rockies, Tibetan fighters learned tactics they'd use in a war their sponsors knew was unwinnable. The program was deniable adventure. The casualties were real. The geopolitical outcome was predetermined. Leopoldville, Congo, 1961. Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first democratically elected prime minister, was charismatic, nationalist, and viewed as dangerously unpredictable by Washington. CIA station chiefs received orders to eliminate Lumumba, with methods ranging from poison to supporting rival factions. Church committee testimony in 1975 revealed the agency shipped poisoned toothpaste and explored other assassination methods, though there's debate over whether these specific tools were ever deployed. What's documented, the CIA worked with Congolese rivals and Belgian intelligence to isolate and capture Lumumba. In January 1961, Lumumba was transferred to Katanga province, where secessionist forces executed him. Belgian officers were present. The CIA's exact role in the execution remains murky, but declassified documents show the agency wanted Lumumba dead and worked toward that goal. His death destabilized Congo for decades. Mobutu Sese Seko, a CIA asset, seized power and ruled as dictator for 32 years, embezzling billions while the country collapsed. The assassination plot succeeded in removing Lumumba. The aftermath was chaos the CIA couldn't control. In Langley's Africa division, Lumumba's elimination was filed as a operational success. In Congo, it was the beginning of generational catastrophe. The poisoned toothpaste became symbolic of Cold War absurdity. Regime change reduced to mail-order murder kits that may or may not have been used, while the larger machinery of destabilization ground forward regardless. Luanda, 1975. As Portugal withdrew from Angola, three factions fought for control: the Impla by Cuba and the USSR, Finla by the US, and Zaire and UNITA by South Africa and the EU. CIA Director William Colby coordinated covert support, weapons, funds, and advisors for anti-communist forces. Senate Intelligence Committee hearings later revealed the operation's scope and the risk. Cuban troops were arriving in significant numbers, and escalation could mean direct confrontation with Soviet-backed forces. Some officials pushed for expanded military involvement, including U.S. air support and combat advisors. Colby and Secretary of State Kissinger debated the options, but Congress intervened. The Clark Amendment, passed in December 1975, prohibited further covert military assistance to Angola. The Impla won the Civil War. Cuban troops stayed in Angola for over a decade. The U.S. lost the proxy war but avoided a larger conflict. The Angola decision became a Cold War turning point, Congress asserting control over covert operations, limiting executive branch freedom to wage undeclared wars. In classified briefings, Angola was the war the CIA wanted to escalate but couldn't. The amendment was a rare example of restraint imposed from outside the executive branch. The proxy war continued at lower levels for years. The larger confrontation was postponed, not prevented. Corinto, Nicaragua, 1984. The Reagan administration supported Contra rebels fighting Nicaragua's Sandinista government. When Congress restricted funding, the CIA took direct action, mining Nicaraguan harbors to disrupt shipping and pressure the regime. The operation, overseen by CIA Director William Casey, damaged vessels from multiple nations, including a Soviet oil tanker. Nicaragua sued the United States at the International Court of Justice. The World Court ruled in Nicaragua's favor in 1986, ordering the U.S. to pay reparations and cease illegal military action. The Reagan administration rejected the court's jurisdiction and refused to comply. Declassified documents show the harbor mining was intended as escalatory pressure. With full knowledge, it risked international backlash and potential confrontation with Soviet vessels. The operation succeeded in damaging Nicaragua's economy, but failed to topple the Sandinistas. More significantly, it contributed to the Iran-Contra scandal when funding mechanisms were exposed. Casey died before testifying fully to Congress. The World Court ruling was ignored. Nicaragua's government eventually fell in elections, but not before the covert war had killed tens of thousands. In Langley's Central America Task Force, the mining operation was tactical creativity. In The Hague, it was a violation of international law. The gap between those assessments was never reconciled. The reparations were never paid. Peshawar, Pakistan, 1986. The CIA supplied Afghan mujahideen fighting Soviet occupation with increasingly sophisticated weapons. The debate over Stinger missiles, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft systems, divided officials. Congressional oversight records show intense arguments. Would Stingers turn the war in Afghanistan's favor, or would they provoke Soviet escalation, possibly targeting Pakistan or even striking CIA supply lines? CIA station chiefs in Peshawar pushed for the missiles, arguing Soviet helicopters were devastating Mujahideen forces. Defense officials worried that shooting down Soviet aircraft with American weapons could trigger retaliation beyond Afghanistan's borders. The missiles were approved in 1986. Afghan fighters used them to deadly effect, shooting down dozens of Soviet helicopters and aircraft. The Soviets didn't retaliate beyond Afghanistan. and the tide of the war shifted. The Usser withdrew by 1989, but the Stingers didn't all get recovered. Hundreds remained in circulation, later used by various militant groups, including some hostile to American interests. The missiles that helped defeat the Soviets became a long-term security problem. In Pentagon strategy sessions, the Stinger decision was a calculated gamble that paid off in the short term. In hindsight, it was also an arms proliferation disaster that would complicate American operations for decades. The missiles are still turning up in conflict zones, weapons that won one war and seeded many others. Baghdad, 1998. Throughout the 1990s, the US and Britain enforced no-fly zones over northern and southern Iraq, ostensibly to protect Kurdish and Shiite populations from Saddam Hussein's forces. Iraqi air defenses regularly fired on coalition aircraft. Air Force pilots, operating under restrictive rules of engagement documented in UN Security Council resolutions, faced a dilemma. Iraqi SAM sites targeted them, but escalating to full-scale strikes risked broader war. The Clinton administration authorized limited strikes on Iraqi air defense systems, but resisted calls for regime change operations. In December 1998, Operation Desert Fox launched 4 days of bombing against Iraqi military and intelligence targets after Saddam expelled UN weapons inspectors. The strikes were calibrated, enough to punish, not enough to trigger regional war or justify a ground invasion. Some military officials wanted to expand the operation to decapitate the regime. Clinton refused. The strikes degraded Iraqi capabilities but left Saddam in power. The restraint was temporary. 5 years later, the Iraq War would erase those boundaries. In 1998, the decision was to wound but not kill. The rationale was containment without occupation. The result was a frozen conflict that lasted until someone chose a different option. Strike assessments filed in classified Pentagon reviews called it strategic ambiguity. Iraqi citizens living under sanctions and intermittent bombing called it something else entirely. Palomares, Spain, January 1966. A B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs collided with a refueling tanker during a routine operation. The bomber disintegrated. 7 crew members died. 4 thermonuclear weapons fell toward the Spanish countryside. 2 bombs, conventional explosives, detonated on impact, spreading plutonium across farmland. A 3rd landed intact in a riverbed. The 4th disappeared into the Mediterranean. General Delmar Wilson coordinated the recovery operation, which involved 3,000 U.S. personnel and eventually the Navy's deep submersible Alvin, locating the missing bomb in 2,850 feet of water after an 81-day search. The Broken Arrow investigation, military code for lost nuclear weapons, revealed how close Spain came to nuclear contamination disaster. The U.S. removed 1,400 tons of radioactive soil and vegetation. Spain demanded assurances that American nuclear flights would cease over Spanish territory. They didn't. The accident remained partially classified for years. Local farmers received minimal compensation. The cleanup was declared successful, but studies later found residual plutonium in the soil. In Pentagon accident reports, Palomares was a recovery success. In Spanish villages, it was a radiation legacy that never fully disappeared. 4 hydrogen bombs fell from the sky. 3 were found relatively quickly. 1 required a submarine and months of searching. The reassuring part of that sentence depends entirely on your threshold for acceptable nuclear accidents. Thule Air Base, Greenland, January 1968. Another B-52, another crash, another Broken Arrow. The bomber, carrying 4 hydrogen bombs on airborne alert, caught fire and crashed onto sea ice near the base. The conventional explosives in all 4 weapons detonated, scattering plutonium across the ice and into the water. The bomber crew ejected. 1 died. Danish government protests erupted immediately. Greenland was Danish territory, and Denmark had a nuclear-free policy. The U.S. military mounted a massive cleanup in subarctic conditions, recovering bomb fragments and contaminated ice. But one weapon's secondary stage, the part containing enriched uranium, was never fully recovered and likely remains on the ocean floor. Declassified documents reveal the Pentagon knew the risks of these airborne alerts, but considered the deterrent value worth it. Denmark's nuclear-free policy was technically violated every time nuclear-armed bombers flew over Greenland, but the U.S. maintained the flights were necessary for strategic readiness. The Thule crash ended the airborne alert program. Keeping nuclear-armed bombers constantly in the air was deemed too dangerous after 2 crashes in 2 years. The cleanup removed tons of contaminated material. The missing weapon component stayed missing. In Arctic waters off Greenland, pieces of American nuclear weapons sit in the dark, a Cold War debris field nobody likes to mention. The airborne alerts stopped. The contamination didn't. Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado, November 1979. NORAD's early warning systems detected an incoming Soviet missile attack. Screens showed 220 ICBMs launched and heading toward the United States. The duty officer initiated alert procedures. Strategic bombers prepared for takeoff. Missile crews went to launch readiness. Then someone checked the satellite systems. They showed nothing. The attack was a false alarm caused by a training tape accidentally loaded into the live system. Senate Armed Services Committee inquiries later documented the incident and revealed it happened not once, but 3 times in 18 months due to different technical failures. The closest call lasted 6 minutes before being confirmed as false. 6 minutes between a computer error and potential nuclear war. The duty officer who stopped the process from escalating followed protocol, verified through multiple systems before launching. The system worked, barely. The Senate investigation mandated better safeguards and redundancy checks, but the fundamental problem remained: automated systems designed to give mere minutes for decisions about species-ending war. In underground command centers, the alerts became routine enough to have procedures. That routine was the only thing standing between technical malfunction and apocalypse. The training tape was removed. The vulnerability to catastrophic error remained embedded in systems built for speed over certainty. West Germany, November 1983. NATO conducted Able Archer 83, a command exercise simulating the transition from conventional to nuclear war. The exercise used new encrypted communications, involved senior officials playing roles up to the president level, and practiced nuclear release procedures with unusual realism. Soviet intelligence, monitored by the KGB and analyzed in later declassified assessments, interpreted the exercise as potential cover for an actual first strike. General Bernard Rogers commanded NATO forces, unaware that Soviet nuclear forces had gone to heightened alert status. The Reagan administration's aggressive rhetoric and recent deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe had Soviet leadership genuinely worried about surprise attack. For several days, the world's 2 nuclear superpowers were on higher alert than either fully realized, with the Soviets misreading an exercise as potential attack preparation and NATO unaware of Soviet panic. The exercise ended. Soviet forces stood down. The danger passed without most people knowing it existed. Intelligence assessments released years later showed how close the misunderstanding came to triggering actual military response. In Brussels NATO headquarters, Able Archer was routine training. In Moscow, it looked like final preparations for war. The gap between those perceptions was a miscalculation away from catastrophe. Both sides claimed their systems had safeguards. Both sides scared themselves more than they knew. Sakhalin Island, September 1983. Korean Airlines Flight 007, a Boeing 747 traveling from New York to Seoul, drifted off course into Soviet airspace. Soviet fighters intercepted the aircraft. Believing it was a reconnaissance plane, it was flying near a U.S. spy plane route. A Soviet pilot fired missiles, destroying the 747 and killing all 269 people aboard. President Reagan's response, documented in National Security Council transcripts, was fury and condemnation, calling it a crime against humanity. The U.S. considered military retaliation. War games were run. The Soviets initially denied shooting down the plane, then claimed it was a justified response to airspace violation. The crisis revealed how quickly an accident, Cal 007's navigation error, could become an international incident threatening military confrontation. Diplomatic efforts prevented escalation, but U.S.-Soviet relations hit their lowest point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The aftermath included improved civilian aviation safety protocols and communication channels between air traffic control systems. But it also entrenched Cold War hostility at a moment when Able Archer was weeks away. The Soviets eventually admitted the shootdown was a mistake. The admission took years. Reagan used the incident for propaganda. The dead passengers became casualties of a confrontation neither government intended. In Soviet Air Defense Command, the fighter pilot followed orders. In Washington, those orders looked like murder. Both things were true. Persian Gulf, July 1988. The Vincennes, a guided missile cruiser, tracked what its crew believed was an attacking Iranian F-14 fighter. Captain William Rogers ordered the ship's systems to fire. 2 missiles destroyed the target. The target was Iran Air Flight 655, an Airbus A300 civilian airliner on a scheduled flight, climbing in a recognized commercial air corridor. All 290 people aboard died. The ICAO investigation revealed a series of errors, misidentification of the aircraft, incorrect reading of its altitude and trajectory, and assumption it was descending to attack when it was actually climbing. The Vincennes was in Iranian territorial waters during a naval confrontation with Iranian gunboats. Tensions were high. The cruiser's systems were sophisticated, but not foolproof. Rogers believed he was defending his ship. He was wrong. The Reagan administration expressed regret, but refused to apologize, arguing the crew acted in self-defense based on available information. Iran called it deliberate murder. The U.S. eventually paid $61.8 million in compensation to victims' families without admitting legal liability. Rogers was never court-martialed. He retired and later received a medal, though not for the Vincennes incident. In the Persian Gulf's complex combat environment, the line between threat and civilian aircraft vanished in minutes. The Aegis system was designed to protect the ship. It failed to protect the passengers who never knew they'd been mistaken for an enemy. Sophisticated technology made the wrong call. Everyone who died aboard Flight 655 paid for it. Crimea, February 1988. The Yorktown, asserting freedom of navigation rights, sailed within Soviet territorial waters in the Black Sea. Soviet Navy vessels deliberately rammed the American cruiser and a destroyer traveling with it in a maneuver called shouldering. The ships collided multiple times. Soviet records, reviewed by historians after the Cold War, show the ramming was intentional, a physical assertion of territorial sovereignty. The U.S. claimed innocent passage through international waters. The Soviets claimed the ships violated the 12-mile territorial limit. Both navies prepared for escalation if the confrontation turned from bumping to shooting. It didn't. The ships separated. Diplomatic protests were filed. The incident was contained. But it revealed how quickly Cold War tensions could turn physical, with warships playing chicken in contested waters. The legal dispute over territorial seas wasn't resolved. Both sides maintained their positions. The bumping incidents became part of a broader pattern of naval confrontations in the 1980s, as both superpowers tested each other's resolve and boundaries. In the Black Sea's gray waters, the collision marks were photographed and filed as evidence of Soviet aggression. From Moscow, they were evidence of American provocation. The ships were designed to sink each other with missiles. Instead, they scraped paint in a slow-motion game of territorial assertion. It was absurd, until you realized how easily it could have become something else. Taiwan Strait, March 1996. China conducted missile tests and military exercises near Taiwan in response to the island's first direct presidential election, which Beijing viewed as a step toward independence. Taiwan's voters weren't deterred. They went to the polls. But China's missiles splashed down close enough to commercial shipping lanes to qualify as intimidation. The Clinton administration, reviewing Pentagon deployment orders, sent 2 carrier battle groups to the region, the US Independence and US Nimitz, the largest U.S. military deployment near Taiwan since the 1950s. Carrier battle group commanders prepared for potential confrontation if China escalated to blockade or invasion. The deployment was calculated signaling. America would defend Taiwan if pushed. China conducted its exercises and then backed down. The crisis passed. Taiwan held its election. But the strait remained a flashpoint. The 1996 crisis revealed how Taiwan's political evolution could trigger military confrontation between nuclear powers. The carriers didn't fire. Their presence was the message. In Pentagon strategy sessions, the deployment was deterrence through overwhelming force. In Beijing, it was humiliating reminder of American naval superiority. Both interpretations were accurate. The carrier groups sailed home. The unresolved status of Taiwan remained, a frozen conflict waiting for the next crisis, or the next election, or the next missile test. The third Taiwan Strait crisis, as it became known, was the one that didn't quite happen, but showed exactly how the next one might. Caribbean Sea, October 1962. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Soviet submarine B-59 was detected by U.S. Navy destroyers practicing depth charging. The submarine, diesel-powered and running low on oxygen, had been submerged for days. The crew was exhausted. The captain and political officer, believing war had begun and unable to communicate with Moscow, decided to launch a nuclear-tipped torpedo at the American fleet. Soviet protocol required unanimous agreement from the submarine's 3 senior officers. Captain Valentin Savitsky and political officer Ivan Maslenikov voted to launch. Vasily Arkhipov, the flotilla commander aboard as second captain, refused authorization. He convinced Savitsky to surface and await orders rather than start a nuclear war based on assumptions. The submarine surfaced, embarrassing but alive. The crisis de-escalated days later. Arkhipov's decision wasn't celebrated for decades. It remained classified in Soviet records until the Cold War ended. In 2002, at a conference on the missile crisis, surviving participants revealed how close the submarine came to launching. One man's refusal to authorize nuclear weapons use prevented World War III. No monument was built. No medal was publicly awarded. Arkhipov died in 1998, his decision unknown to most of history. In the dark waters of the Caribbean, nuclear war came down to 3 men voting, and one who said no when yes would have been procedurally acceptable. The torpedo stayed in its tube. The fleet above never knew how close it came. Serpukhov 15, Soviet Union, September 1983. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat in a bunker monitoring satellite early warning systems when alarms indicated 5 U.S. ICBMs launched and heading toward the Soviet Union. Protocol required him to report the attack to superiors, who would likely order retaliatory strikes. Petrov had minutes to decide. He assessed the situation, only 5 missiles detected, which seemed like an odd number for a first strike. The satellite system was new and potentially unreliable. Ground radar showed nothing. He reported the alarm as a system malfunction, not an attack. He was right. Sunlight reflecting off clouds had triggered false readings. His decision prevented the Soviet military from launching a retaliatory nuclear strike based on faulty data. Petrov was reprimanded for improper paperwork during the incident and retired early. His role remained secret until 1998, when the story leaked to Western media. Russia eventually recognized his action, but the official acknowledgement was grudging and incomplete. Petrov died in 2017, having prevented nuclear war through the simple act of questioning his instruments and trusting his analysis over protocol. In a bunker south of Moscow, one man's skepticism about technology saved the world. The satellite system was fixed. The vulnerability to catastrophic error remained inherent to systems that demanded split-second decisions about species survival. Checkpoint Charlie, Berlin, August 1961. Soviet and American tanks faced each other across the newly constructed Berlin Wall, barrels pointed, crews ready. President Kennedy, monitoring the crisis from Washington via NSC meeting minutes, faced pressure to respond forcefully to the wall's construction and Soviet aggression. His military advisors presented options ranging from bulldozing the wall to military confrontation. Kennedy chose restraint. He acknowledged the wall was a Soviet sector issue, not worth triggering war. The standoff lasted 16 hours. Both sides blinked simultaneously, withdrawing tanks in coordinated de-escalation. Kennedy's decision was criticized by Hawks as weakness, allowing communist division of Berlin without military response. Kennedy's calculation was different. The wall was ugly and inhumane, but it stabilized the crisis by ending the flood of refugees, destabilizing East Germany. Fighting over it risked nuclear confrontation over a barrier that, however symbolically offensive, didn't threaten Western Berlin's viability. The wall stood for 28 years. Kennedy's restraint prevented war in 1961. Whether that choice was moral or merely pragmatic remained debated. In White House strategy rooms, the decision was to accept Soviet fait accompli rather than fight. The tanks withdrew. The wall stayed. Berlin remained divided, but didn't become a battlefield. Egypt. November 1956. Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt after President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. The operation was classic colonial intervention. British and French paratroopers seized the canal while Israeli forces advanced through Sinai. President Dwight Eisenhower, kept in the dark by his allies, was furious. Rather than support the invasion, he demanded immediate withdrawal. His leverage was economic. The U.S. threatened to dump British pound sterling reserves, collapsing Britain's currency, and blocked British access to inflows. Eisenhower brought the issue to an emergency UN session, where the U.S. voted with the Soviet Union against its own allies. The message was clear: the colonial era was over, and American opposition made the invasion unsustainable. Britain and France withdrew in humiliation. Israel evacuated Sinai months later under U.S. pressure. The Suez Crisis marked the end of British and French imperial power and the beginning of American dominance in the Middle East. Eisenhower's decision was based partly on principle, opposing colonial aggression, and partly on Cold War calculation. Soviet threats to intervene gave the invasion potential to trigger wider war. The ultimatum worked. The invasion ended. In quiet Washington meetings, Eisenhower demonstrated that American allies could be stopped as effectively as enemies if interests diverged. The special relationship with Britain survived. British illusions about empire didn't. Tokyo, April 1951. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding UN forces in Korea, publicly advocated expanding the war into China, including potential use of nuclear weapons to destroy Chinese bases and supply lines. President Harry Truman, reading MacArthur's insubordinate statements and unauthorized communications with congressional Republicans, faced a crisis of civilian control over military. Senate hearings testimony later documented MacArthur's repeated defiance of presidential directives to limit the war. Truman decided to relieve MacArthur of command, despite the general's immense popularity and status as a war hero. The firing triggered political firestorm. MacArthur returned to ticker tape parades and addressed Congress to thunderous applause. Truman's approval ratings plummeted. But the principle was established. Presidents control war policy, not generals, regardless of military genius or popular acclaim. MacArthur wanted to win at any cost. Truman wanted to avoid World War III with China and the Soviet Union over Korea. The hearings eventually vindicated Truman. Military leaders testified that MacArthur's strategy risked global war without guarantee of victory. The Korean War ended in stalemate 2 years later, without nuclear weapons use or Chinese invasion. MacArthur faded into retirement. Truman's decision remained controversial but set precedent for civilian authority during the Cold War's most dangerous moments. In the Oval Office's quiet calculations, losing a general was acceptable. Losing control of nuclear decisions wasn't. Tokyo, April 1951. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding UN forces in Korea, publicly advocated expanding the war into China, including potential use of nuclear weapons to destroy Chinese bases and supply lines. President Harry Truman, reading MacArthur's insubordinate statements and unauthorized communications with congressional Republicans, faced a crisis of civilian control over military. Senate hearings testimony later documented MacArthur's repeated defiance of presidential directives to limit the war. Truman decided to relieve MacArthur of command, despite the general's immense popularity and status as a war hero. The firing triggered political firestorm. MacArthur returned to ticker-tape parades and addressed Congress to thunderous applause. Truman's approval ratings plummeted. But the principle was established. Presidents control war policy, not generals, regardless of military genius or popular acclaim. MacArthur wanted to win at any cost. Truman wanted to avoid World War III with China and the Soviet Union over Korea. The hearings eventually vindicated Truman. Military leaders testified that MacArthur's strategy risked global war without guarantee of victory. The Korean War ended in stalemate 2 years later, without nuclear weapons use or Chinese invasion. MacArthur faded into retirement. Truman's decision remained controversial, but set precedent for civilian authority during the Cold War's most dangerous moments. In the Oval Office's quiet calculations, losing a general was acceptable. Losing control of nuclear decisions wasn't. Saigon, 1968. General William Westmoreland requested 206,000 additional troops for Vietnam after the Tet Offensive exposed the war's deteriorating situation. The request would have required mobilizing reserves and expanding the draft, effectively putting the U.S. on total war footing. President Lyndon Johnson, reviewing the request with civilian advisors, faced the decision that would define his presidency's end. Defense Secretary Clark Clifford, newly appointed, conducted a systematic review and concluded escalation wouldn't work. More troops would mean more casualties without achieving victory. Johnson rejected Westmoreland's request. He approved only a token increase of 13,500 troops. The decision marked the beginning of de-escalation. A month later, Johnson announced he wouldn't seek re-election, effectively ending his political career. Westmoreland's request represented military logic. More force would turn the tide. Johnson's refusal represented political reality. The American public wouldn't support unlimited escalation for a war without clear purpose or endpoint. The Cambodia invasion happened under Nixon, but Johnson's 1968 decision prevented full mobilization that could have made Vietnam even more catastrophic. In the cabinet room, Johnson chose political suicide over military escalation. The war continued for 7 more years under different management. The additional 206,000 troops never deployed. Whether that saved lives or prolonged defeat depends on which failure you're measuring. St. George's, Grenada, October 1983. When a Marxist coup threatened American medical students and created a potential Cuban-Soviet base in the Caribbean, Reagan ordered invasion. But NSC advisors imposed strict operational limits, secure the students, neutralize Cuban forces, restore democratic government, then leave. Pentagon officials wanted broader goals, using Grenada as a base for regional operations, permanent military presence, expansion into Nicaragua support. Reagan refused. The operation, Urgent Fury, lasted 3 days. The students were evacuated. Cuban construction workers and military advisors were defeated or captured. A provisional government was installed. U.S. forces withdrew within weeks. The intervention was criticized internationally. The UN condemned it as a violation of sovereignty, but was popular domestically and avoided the mission creep that plagued other operations. Reagan's decision to keep the invasion limited prevented Grenada from becoming another Vietnam-scale commitment or a launching point for broader Central American wars. The restriction frustrated military planners who saw opportunity for regional dominance. In White House Situation Rooms, the limits were intentional: achieve the objective, declare victory, leave. Grenada became a model for limited intervention. The medical students were safe. The regional war didn't expand. Whether that was restraint or simply successful public relations depends on your definition of mission accomplished. Kuwait, February 1991. Iraqi forces, retreating from Kuwait City, formed a massive convoy on the highway to Basra. U.S. aircraft attacked the column, destroying thousands of vehicles in what became known as the Highway of Death. The carnage was complete: burned-out trucks, abandoned tanks, and Iraqi soldiers fleeing on foot. General Norman Schwarzkopf and field commanders reported the route to Baghdad was open. Iraqi forces were in chaos. Saddam's regime was vulnerable. President George H.W. Bush, consulting with Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Colin Powell, ordered a ceasefire after 100 hours of ground combat. The decision not to march to Baghdad was criticized by some as incomplete victory, leaving Saddam in power to threaten the region and brutalize Iraqi civilians. Bush's calculation was different. The UN mandate authorized Kuwait's liberation, not regime change. Occupying Iraq would require years of nation-building. Arab coalition partners opposed toppling Saddam, and casualties would mount in urban warfare. The war ended. Kuwait was liberated. Saddam remained. 12 years later, Bush's son would make the opposite choice, invading Iraq and removing Saddam with consequences that vindicated the father's restraint. In 1991, the decision was to stop at victory's definition, not expand it. The Highway of Death became a symbol of American firepower. The choice not to continue to Baghdad became a symbol of something rarer: restraint at the moment of maximum advantage. The ceasefire held. The unfinished business waited for another president, another war, another set of miscalculations. Honduras, 1910. The country owed money to American banks, and Secretary of State Philander Knox had a solution: gunboat diplomacy, backed by the United Fruit Company's economic interests. United Fruit correspondence, preserved in corporate archives, shows the company lobbying for military intervention to protect their plantations and ensure debt repayment. Knox obliged. U.S. warships appeared in Honduran ports, a physical reminder that unpaid loans could become military occupations. The implicit threat worked. Honduras restructured its debt under terms favorable to American creditors and granted United Fruit expanded land concessions. No invasion was necessary. The ship's presence was the invasion, delivered as financial consulting. The pattern repeated across Central America and the Caribbean. Economic pressure backed by naval power. Sovereign governments negotiating with battleships in their harbors. Honduras remained nominally independent while its economy answered to Boston banks and fruit companies. In Washington's marble corridors, the arrangement was called dollar diplomacy. In Honduras, it was extortion with excellent naval support. The gunboats eventually left. The debt structure remained, designed to require the gunboats' return if payments stopped. It was imperialism as subscription service: cancel payment, and the battleships reappear. Saudi Arabia, October 1973. Arab nations imposed an oil embargo on the United States for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled. Gas lines stretched for blocks across America. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, in declassified contingency planning sessions, discussed military options for seizing Saudi oil fields if the embargo continued or worsened. The plans weren't casual speculation. They included invasion routes, force requirements, and expected resistance. Kissinger publicly warned that the U.S. wouldn't accept strangulation of its economy. The Saudis understood the message. The embargo lasted 5 months, then ended. Diplomatic negotiations replaced military threats, but the contingency plans stayed filed and ready. British intelligence at the time reported the U.S. was serious about considering military seizure of OPEC oil infrastructure. The invasion didn't happen because the embargo ended, not because the option was off the table. In Pentagon war rooms, Saudi Arabia's oil fields were mapped as potential military objectives. Sovereignty temporarily suspended in favor of energy security. The plans remained classified for decades, a reminder that economic warfare has military backup options. The embargo ended. The alliance resumed. The invasion blueprints stayed in locked cabinets, just in case. It was friendship built on mutual understanding, oil would flow, or the arrangement would become significantly less friendly. Tokyo, 1980s. Japan's economic rise terrified American industries. Trade deficits ballooned. U.S. steel and auto manufacturers demanded action. Commerce Secretary Malcolm Baldrige faced intense pressure to respond to what was framed as economic warfare. Tariff retaliation scenarios, documented in trade policy briefings, included economic measures that could devastate Japanese exports and potentially trigger broader conflict. The fear wasn't just economic. Some officials worried Japan's economic dominance could become regional military power, despite Japan's post-war constitution limiting military forces. The anxiety seems absurd in hindsight, but at the time, best-selling books predicted Japanese economic takeover of America. The Reagan administration imposed some tariffs and negotiated voluntary export restraints, but avoided the full-scale trade war that could have militarized economic tensions. Japan's economic bubble burst in the early 1990s, deflating both the economy and the invasion fears. The trade conflict never became military, but the rhetoric sometimes sounded like war preparation. In congressional hearings, senators spoke of Japanese imports as if describing enemy advances. The hyperbole revealed how quickly economic competition can be framed as existential threat. The trade deficits continued. The military confrontation never materialized. The fear that it might was genuine while it lasted. Balboa, Panama Canal Zone, 1977. President Jimmy Carter negotiated treaties to transfer the canal to Panamanian control by 1999, ending decades of American sovereignty over the zone. Treaty opposition senators, led by Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond, fought ratification with arguments that bordered on advocating permanent occupation. Classified proposals circulated suggesting the U.S. should refuse to leave, maintaining control through military presence, regardless of treaty obligations. The zone had been American territory since 1903, built with American engineering and defended with American bases. Giving it back felt like surrender to many conservatives. The Senate narrowly ratified the treaties, 68-32, just one vote over the two-thirds required. But the opposition included plans for prolonging occupation if the treaties failed, effectively nullifying Panamanian sovereignty through continued military presence. The transfer proceeded on schedule. The canal changed hands peacefully in 1999. The U.S. maintained influence through economic ties without needing military occupation. The 1977 fight revealed how close America came to simply refusing to honor its commitment, holding the canal through force of arms rather than legal agreement. In Senate cloakrooms, the debate was framed as national security. In Panama, it was national dignity. The vote was close enough that a different few senators could have meant decades of prolonged occupation and potential conflict. The canal was transferred. The precedent was set. Even deeply held American assets could be relinquished when politics allowed it. Beijing 2000s. China's currency manipulation, keeping the yuan artificially cheap to boost exports, inflamed American manufacturers and politicians. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson faced demands to declare China a currency manipulator, which would trigger W2 complaints and potential trade sanctions that could spiral into economic warfare. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of billions in trade deficits, millions of manufacturing jobs lost to offshoring. Some officials, documented in Treasury Department briefings, argued for aggressive retaliation, including tariffs that would effectively end normalized trade relations. The risk was mutual economic destruction. China held massive U.S. debt, and could dump Treasury bonds in retaliation. The Bush and Obama administrations chose engagement over confrontation, declining to officially label China a manipulator despite clear evidence. The strategy was long-term integration over short-term punishment, betting that making China dependent on American markets would moderate its behavior. The bet's success is still being evaluated. The trade war that didn't happen in the 2000s arrived in the 2010s under different management, with tariffs and retaliation matching earlier predictions. In Treasury's secure conference rooms, China was both a central partner and potential economic enemy. The policies balanced those contradictions until a different administration decided contradiction was unacceptable. The currency manipulation continued. The official designation was withheld. The trade relationship stayed tense but functional. A standoff postponed rather than resolved. Caracas, 2007. President Hugo Chavez nationalized foreign oil company assets, including ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips operations worth billions. The seizures were legal under Venezuelan law, but violated contracts and international investment treaties. State Department cables, released through WikiLeaks, show U.S. officials discussing response options ranging from economic sanctions to support for opposition forces. Some cables referenced military contingencies if Venezuela threatened to cut off oil exports entirely, or transfer refineries to hostile powers like Iran. Chavez was deliberately provocative, framing nationalization as anti-imperialist action and aligning with Cuba and other U.S. adversaries. The Bush administration imposed targeted sanctions, but avoided broader confrontation. Venezuela remained a major oil supplier to the U.S., despite political hostility. The military options stayed theoretical. Chavez died in 2013. Venezuela's economy collapsed under his successor without American intervention. The 2007 crisis revealed the calculations. Oil was worth tolerating an adversary, but cutting off supply or threatening refineries could trigger responses beyond economics. In foggy bottom strategy sessions, Venezuela was both supplier and potential target. The oil kept flowing. The hostile relationship continued. The military options remained filed as contingencies that proved unnecessary when Venezuela's own mismanagement achieved what sanctions couldn't. Beijing, 2010. China controlled 97% of global rare earth mineral production, elements essential for smartphones, missiles, wind turbines, and modern military hardware. When China restricted exports during a territorial dispute with Japan, Pentagon supply chain reviews documented America's dangerous dependence on a potential adversary for critical materials. Defense officials examined scenarios where China could embargo rare earths during a crisis, crippling U.S. weapons production. The strategic resource confrontation looked different from oil wars. These weren't commodities you could seize with an invasion. They required complex processing that China dominated. Options included emergency mining development in the U.S., stockpile expansion, and in extreme scenarios, military operations to secure alternative sources, or pressure China to resume exports. China lifted the restrictions after international pressure, but the vulnerability remained. The U.S. invested in domestic rare earth production, but decades of Chinese dominance weren't easily reversed. In classified Pentagon assessments, rare earths joined oil as resources worth fighting over if access was threatened. The embargo was temporary. The strategic dependency wasn't. It was a modern version of ancient resource wars, updated for elements most people had never heard of, but couldn't live without. North Korea, 2014. Sony Pictures planned to release The Interview, a comedy about assassinating Kim Jong-un. North Korean hackers, working for the regime, breached Sony's network, leaked confidential data, threatened violence against theaters, and forced Sony to initially cancel the release. President Obama called it an act of vandalism, but NSA Director Admiral Michael Rogers considered it something closer to warfare. State-sponsored attack on a corporation to censor American speech. Digital warfare escalation debates, documented in congressional testimony, centered on whether cyber attacks warranted military response. The Sony hack was destructive, but not violent. Setting a military response threshold risked escalation where any significant hack could trigger kinetic retaliation. Obama imposed sanctions on North Korea. The FBI attributed the attack publicly. Sony eventually released the film digitally, but the questions lingered. When does a cyber attack become an act of war? What level of digital aggression justifies military response? The ambiguity was dangerous. North Korea learned that massive corporate hacks brought sanctions, but not bombs, while the US established precedent that cyber operations existed in a gray zone between crime and war. In NSA's Fort Meade headquarters, the debate continued about where to draw lines in domains where lines didn't exist. The movie got released. The precedent stayed unclear. Cyber attacks multiplied, testing boundaries nobody had successfully defined. Santiago, September 1973. General Augusto Pinochet led a military coup against President Salvador Allende's democratically elected socialist government. Allende died in the presidential palace during the assault, officially suicide, though debate persists. Ambassador Edward Corey's cables, declassified decades later, show extensive CIA communication with Chilean military officers planning the coup. The U.S. publicly denied involvement. The cables told a different story: regular contact with coup plotters, assessment of their plans, and tacit approval at highest levels. The CIA had spent years destabilizing Allende's government through economic pressure and support for opposition groups. When the military moved, American officials weren't surprised. They'd been coordinating with the plotters. Pinochet's regime lasted 17 years, marked by systematic torture, thousands of disappeared civilians, and economic restructuring that became a neoliberal model. The U.S. supported the regime throughout, prioritizing anti-communist stability over human rights. Kissinger, in declassified conversations, dismissed concerns about Pinochet's brutality with cold realism, better a friendly dictator than a hostile democracy. The coup succeeded. Allende was dead. American involvement was denied for decades, then gradually acknowledged, then justified as Cold War necessity. In CIA station offices overlooking Santiago, the operation was filed as successful regime change. In mass graves being discovered decades later, it was something else entirely. Athens, April 1967. Greek military colonels overthrew the elected government days before scheduled elections that left-wing parties seemed likely to win. The coup installed a military junta that suspended civil liberties, arrested thousands, and tortured political opponents. CIA station files declassified through the State Department's Historical Documentation Project revealed American foreknowledge and tacit support. The colonels had American training. Many were graduates of U.S. military schools. CIA officers maintained regular contact with coup leaders. When the coup occurred, the U.S. response was muted concern, followed by quick recognition of the new government. Greece remained a NATO ally. The bases stayed operational. The junta ruled for 7 years, until collapsing after a failed attempt to annex Cyprus. American support for the colonels was never officially acknowledged during their rule. Congressional investigations in the 1970s documented CIA involvement, showing the agency knew the coup was coming and did nothing to discourage it. Tacit approval that allowed democratic government suspension to proceed. In Athens' Syntagma Square, the tanks were Greek. In secure communications to Washington, the coordination was American. The democracy died. The alliance strengthened. That those two facts coexisted bothered some people more than others. Buenos Aires, March 1976. The Argentine military overthrew President Isabel Perné's government, beginning the dirty war that would kill an estimated 30,000 people through torture, execution, and forced disappearances. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger met with Argentine Foreign Minister Admiral Sar Augusto Guzzetti shortly after the coup. Declassified meeting transcripts show Kissinger offering tacit approval. If there are things that have to be done, you should do them quickly. The message was clear. Human rights concerns wouldn't interfere with U.S.-Argentine relations if the junta acted decisively. The Dirty War's techniques included throwing drugged prisoners from aircraft into the ocean, systematic torture in secret detention centers, and stealing babies from murdered dissidents to give to military families. The U.S. continued military aid and training throughout. President Carter later cut aid over human rights concerns, but the damage was done. American support in the junta's critical early phase provided international legitimacy. The declassification project revealing U.S. complicity didn't begin until the 1990s, after Argentina's return to democracy. Kissinger's advice to act quickly was followed. The disappearances happened fast. The accountability came slow, if at all. In State Department meeting rooms, realpolitik trumped human rights. In clandestine prisons across Argentina, the consequences of that calculation played out on human bodies. Islamabad, July 1977. General Mohammad Zia-ul-Haq overthrew Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in a military coup, then had Bhutto tried and executed 2 years later on questionable charges. State Department cables show American officials knew the coup was coming and chose not to intervene or support Bhutto's civilian government. Pakistan was too important strategically, bordering Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, possessing nuclear ambitions, and serving as a counterweight to Soviet-aligned India. The U.S. accepted Zia's coup quickly. When Bhutto was sentenced to death, American protests were pro forma, enough to show concern, not enough to actually pressure Zia to commute the sentence. Bhutto was hanged in April 1979. Zia ruled until his death in a 1988 plane crash. During his rule, Pakistan became the staging ground for CIA operations, supporting Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviets, making Zia an indispensable ally despite his authoritarian brutality and Islamization policies that reshaped Pakistani society. The cables documenting American silence during Bhutto's trial showed calculated indifference. Democracy in Pakistan was less important than stability and access. In Rawalpindi's military headquarters, Zia consolidated power. In Washington's Pakistan desk, the consolidation was noted and accepted. The execution proceeded. The alliance strengthened. Those facts weren't contradictory, they were the alliance. Ankara, September 1980. The Turkish military seized power from a civilian government paralyzed by political violence and economic crisis. Ambassador Ronald Spires and CIA station officers had advance warning of the coup through contacts with Turkish officers. Declassified diplomatic cables show American officials knew the military was preparing to act and chose not to alert or defend the civilian government. Turkey was NATO's eastern anchor, too strategically vital to risk losing over democratic niceties. The coup was bloodless. The aftermath wasn't. Thousands were arrested, torture was systematic, and political parties were banned. But Turkey remained stable, secular, and aligned with the West. The U.S. continued military aid without interruption. The advance warning evidence wasn't released until decades later, showing American officials weighing democratic principles against strategic interests and choosing interests. The Turkish officers who briefed Americans on coup plans knew they faced no opposition from their most important ally. In Ankara's military command, the coup was meticulously planned. In the U.S. Embassy, the plan was noted and filed. Martial law was declared. The NATO partnership continued unaffected. The acceptance of military rule over democracy was unspoken policy, documented in cables that stayed classified for 30 years. La Paz, July 1980. General Luis Garca Meza led a coup so corrupt it became known as the cocaine coup, backed by drug traffickers and Argentine military advisors who brought dirty war techniques to Bolivia. DEA reports documented Garca Meza's ties to cocaine production and trafficking, making him one of the first narco-state leaders. The U.S. publicly condemned the coup, but classified assessments reveal a different calculation. Bolivia was strategically minor, the previous government had leftist tendencies, and Garcha Meza's anti-communism made him tolerable despite the drug connections. The Carter administration cut aid. The Reagan administration quietly restored some assistance. The regime lasted 13 months, characterized by murders, disappearances, an explosion of cocaine production that would fuel the drug wars of the 1980s. Garcha Meza was eventually extradited and imprisoned decades later, but the damage was done. Bolivia became a narco-state, and the U.S. had signaled that anti-communist credentials could outweigh drug trafficking. In DIA field offices, the contradiction was stark, fighting the drug war while tolerating drug trafficking dictators. In Cold War strategy rooms, the contradiction was acceptable. The cocaine flowed north. The anti-communist government lasted just long enough to matter. The precedent suggested some corruption was strategically acceptable, a message that drug cartels understood perfectly. Monrovia, April 1980. Master Sergeant Samuel Doe led a coup, executing President William Tolbert and most of his cabinet on the beach in a public spectacle of brutality. CIA assessments of Doe's regime noted his incompetence and violence, but recommended support based on Liberia's strategic position and Doe's anti-Soviet stance. Liberia hosted Voice of America transmitters and provided African access for American intelligence. Doe's rule was characterized by ethnic violence, corruption, and eventually civil war, but U.S. aid continued. The Reagan administration made Doe one of the largest per capita recipients of American aid in Africa, despite documented human rights abuses and kleptocracy. The relationship soured only when Liberia descended into chaos that affected American interests. Doe was captured and tortured to death by rebels in 1990, an end matching his beginning. The U.S. evacuation of embassy staff in 1990 marked the abandonment of a proxy who'd outlived his usefulness. CIA documentation shows officials knew Doe was unreliable and brutal from the start, but supported him as a Cold War chess piece. In Monrovia's diplomatic quarter, the calculation was explicit. Stability through strongman, regardless of the strongman's character. The stability never arrived. The support continued until the strongman's gruesome end. The policy was filed as pragmatism. The bodies were filed as acceptable losses in a larger game. Port-au-Prince, September 1991. The Haitian military overthrew President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, Haiti's first democratically elected president, 7 months after his inauguration. CIA station reports, later revealed through congressional investigations, showed agency knowledge of coup plotting and contact with some plotters. The U.S. publicly condemned the coup, but didn't act forcefully to restore Aristide, who spent 3 years in exile while the military junta ruled with increasing brutality. The CIA's relationship with junta leaders, particularly through intelligence sharing on drug trafficking, suggested acquiescence, if not outright support. Some officials distrusted Aristide's populist politics and preferred military stability to democratic uncertainty. Clinton eventually restored Aristide through U.S. military intervention in 1994. But the 3-year delay and documented CIA contacts with the junta revealed ambivalence about Haiti's democracy. Aristide's second presidency ended in another coup in 2004, this time with even less American opposition. The pattern suggested democracy in Haiti was acceptable when it produced acceptable results and negotiable when it didn't. In CIA's Haiti files, Aristide was simultaneously the legitimate president and a problem requiring management. The cognitive dissonance was resolved by supporting democracy in theory while tolerating its overthrow in practice. The junta ruled for 3 years. The relationship with Washington stayed functional. The restoration of democracy came only when political calculus shifted. It was support for democracy as conditional offer, subject to terms and conditions applied selectively. New York, June 1971. Daniel Ellsberg, a former Pentagon analyst and Rand Corporation researcher, photocopied a classified study titled United States-Vietnam Relations, 1945-1967, and delivered it to the New York Times. The Pentagon Papers, as they became known, documented systematic deception across 4 presidential administrations. The study showed officials knew the Vietnam War was unwinnable while publicly claiming progress. It revealed the Gulf of Tonkin incident's ambiguities, secret bombing campaigns in Laos and Cambodia, and deliberate manipulation of casualty estimates. The Nixon administration sought an injunction to stop publication, citing national security. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in favor of the press, establishing crucial First Amendment precedent. Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act, but the case collapsed when it emerged that Nixon's plumbers unit had burglarized Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office seeking damaging information, illegal activity that foreshadowed Watergate. The papers exposed the gap between classified truth and public narrative. Officials had known for years that victory was implausible, but continued the war to avoid the political cost of admitting failure. The revelations didn't end the war, it continued 4 more years, but they destroyed public trust in official statements about military progress. In New York Times offices, editors faced government threats while publishing history's indictment of policy. The documents proved what protesters had claimed. The war's justifications were constructed, its progress exaggerated, its continuation driven by politics rather than strategy. Washington, 1975. Senator Frank Church chaired hearings that became the most comprehensive investigation of U.S. intelligence agencies ever conducted. The Church Committee examined CIA and FBI abuses, spanning decades, assassination plots against foreign leaders, illegal domestic surveillance, human radiation experiments, and covert wars conducted without congressional knowledge. Testimony revealed plans to kill Fidel Castro using poisoned cigars and exploding seashells, plots against Lumumba in Congo, operations to destabilize Chile's government, and FBI's COINTELPRO operations targeting civil rights leaders and anti-war activists. The hearings documented intelligence agencies operating as rogue entities, accountable to no one, conducting operations that violated American law and international norms. Former CIA Director Richard Helms testified about destruction of evidence. Station chiefs described operations authorized through verbal orders leaving no paper trail. The committee heard from targets of surveillance, Americans spied on for exercising constitutional rights. The revelations led to reforms, creation of permanent intelligence oversight committees, restrictions on assassination and human experimentation, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act establishing judicial review for domestic surveillance. But the reforms were structural, not cultural. The agencies adapted, finding new ways to operate in gray areas. Church's final report warned that intelligence capabilities designed for external enemies could be turned against American citizens if unchecked. The warning was prescient. In Senate hearing rooms, witnesses described a shadow government operating parallel to constitutional authority. The testimony was damning. The accountability was limited. The machinery adjusted but continued operating. Congress, July 1987. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North sat before congressional committees investigating the Iran-Contra affair, delivering testimony that became must-see television. The scandal involved selling weapons to Iran, officially under arms embargo, and diverting profits to fund Nicaraguan Contra, rebels despite congressional prohibition. North, working from the White House basement, had coordinated both operations with apparent authorization from higher officials. The televised testimony revealed parallel government operations bypassing legal restrictions through creative interpretation and deliberate deception. North became a polarizing figure. Defenders saw a patriot serving his country. Critics saw operatives subverting democracy. His secretary, Fiona Hill, had shredded documents before investigators arrived. CIA Director William Casey died before fully testifying. President Reagan claimed not to remember authorizing the operations, a defense of implausible deniability. The hearings revealed weapons flowing to Iran through Israeli intermediaries, money transferred through Swiss accounts to Contra forces, and a procurement network operating outside official channels. The constitutional crisis centered on whether executive branch could conduct foreign policy and fund wars Congress had prohibited. Independent counsel Lawrence Walsh's investigation resulted in convictions that were later overturned on technicalities or pardoned by President Bush. The illegal arms sales were documented. The investigation was thorough. The accountability evaporated through legal maneuvering and political protection. In White House Situation Rooms, the operation had been justified as necessary to free hostages and fight communism. In congressional hearing rooms, it looked like contempt for constitutional limits. Both perspectives were documented. Neither was fully resolved. Walter Reed Medical Center, 1990s. Gulf War veterans returned home with mysterious symptoms, chronic fatigue, cognitive problems, joint pain, and respiratory issues that military doctors initially dismissed. Veterans' testimony before congressional committees described exposure to chemical weapons during Iraq's demolition, proximity to burning oil wells, and experimental vaccines administered without informed consent. The Pentagon denied chemical weapons exposure for years, insisting Iraq hadn't used such weapons, and coalition forces hadn't encountered them. Declassified logs and sensor readings later proved otherwise. Troops had been exposed when coalition demolitions destroyed Iraqi chemical weapons stockpiles, and alarm systems had detected nerve agents that officials claimed were false positives. The cover-up allegations centered on whether military leadership knowingly exposed troops to toxins, and then denied it to avoid accountability and compensation costs. The Department of Veterans Affairs initially refused to recognize Gulf War syndrome as a service-connected disability. Only after sustained congressional pressure and investigative journalism did the VA establish a registry and compensation program. The exact cause remained debated. Was it chemical exposure, vaccine reactions, depleted uranium, or some combination? What wasn't debated was that veterans had been ignored, their illnesses dismissed as psychological, and evidence of exposure had been denied despite existing records. In military medical facilities, the pattern was familiar. Blame the victim, question the symptoms, protect the institution. The veterans persisted. The recognition came slowly. The full accounting of what troops were exposed to never completely emerged from classified assessments that remained partially redacted decades later. Iraq, April 2004. CBS News broadcast photographs from Abu Ghraib prison showing U.S. military personnel engaged in detainee abuse. The images documented coercive interrogation practices, humiliation techniques, and treatment widely condemned as torture. Specialist Joseph Darby, a military police officer at the prison, had provided the photographs to military investigators months earlier, triggering an internal investigation. Major General Antonio Taguba's report, initially classified, documented systemic failures in detention operations and leadership. The photographs became international scandal, destroying American credibility on human rights and providing propaganda for insurgents. The Bush administration claimed the abuse was isolated misconduct by low-ranking personnel, not policy. The Taguba report suggested otherwise. Interrogation techniques migrated from Guantanamo and Afghanistan, with authorization from senior officials, creating an environment where abuse was normalized. 7 soldiers were court-martialed and imprisoned. No senior officers or Pentagon officials faced criminal charges, though some received administrative reprimands. The photographs revealed what classified legal memos had authorized enhanced interrogation techniques that international law defined as torture. The gap between public denials and documented practices was photographic evidence that couldn't be explained away. In Baghdad's detention facilities, the techniques were taught and practiced. In Washington's legal offices, they were authorized and justified through memos redefining torture's legal boundaries. The scandal damaged America's moral authority. The accountability stopped at junior enlisted ranks. The policies that created the environment remained debated, but largely unpunished. Yemen, 2010s. The Obama administration dramatically expanded drone warfare for targeted killings, publicly claiming precision strikes minimize civilian casualties. Whistleblowers and investigative journalists from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism documented a different reality: strikes killing civilians, targeting based on behavioral patterns rather than confirmed identity, and classification systems counting all military-age males as combatants, unless proven otherwise posthumously. The targeted killing program operated with minimal oversight, kill lists approved by the president, strikes conducted by CIA and military without congressional notification for each operation, and civilian casualties dismissed as necessary collateral damage or reclassified as militants. The transparency gap was stark. The administration acknowledged the program's existence, but refused to release targeting criteria, legal justifications, or accurate casualty counts. Documents leaked by intelligence community members showed the gulf between public assurances and operational reality. Families of civilians killed in strikes had no recourse. The government neither confirmed nor denied specific operations, making accountability impossible. Some strikes targeted American citizens abroad without trial, raising constitutional questions. The administration answered with classified legal memos declaring executive authority to kill citizens deemed terrorist threats. The legal framework was secret. The operations were deniable. The casualties were real, but uncounted in official statistics. In Yemen's tribal regions, the drones circled constantly, their presence reshaping daily life around the possibility of sudden death. In Washington's national security offices, the program was defended as necessary counterterrorism. The definitions of necessity and terrorism were classified, making public debate nearly impossible. Washington, December 2019. The Washington Post published the Afghanistan Papers, based on interviews conducted by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. The documents revealed senior officials systematically misleading the public about the war's progress for 18 years. Cigar interviews, obtained through Freedom of Information Act litigation, showed military commanders, diplomats, and administration officials privately acknowledging the war was unwinnable while publicly claiming progress. The deception spanned 4 presidential administrations. Officials described fabricating metrics to show success, pursuing incompatible objectives simultaneously, and continuing operations purely to avoid admitting failure. One official told Cigar, "We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing." Another admitted metrics were made up to satisfy congressional and public demands for evidence of progress. The documents showed trillions spent, thousands of American lives lost, and hundreds of thousands of Afghan casualties for a mission that insiders knew was failing throughout. The parallels to the Pentagon Papers were explicit. Once again, classified assessments contradicted public statements, and once again, the truth emerged only through investigation and legal pressure. The Afghanistan Papers were published while the war continued. The revelations changed nothing operationally. American troops remained deployed until the chaotic 2021 withdrawal proved the pessimistic assessments correct. In Kabul's fortified compounds, officials wrote optimistic reports for Washington. In Washington's oversight offices, Cigar investigators documented the gap between those reports and reality. The public received the optimistic version. The true assessment stayed classified until journalists forced its release. The pattern from Vietnam to Afghanistan suggested institutional learning occurred primarily in sophisticated deception, not successful strategy. Cuba, April 1961. Approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the CIA, landed at the Bay of Pigs with plans to overthrow Fidel Castro. The operation failed catastrophically within 3 days. Most invaders were killed or captured. The failure was predicted. CIA Director Allen Dulles and military advisors had briefed President Kennedy that success required U.S. air support, which Kennedy refused to provide, fearing overt American involvement would trigger Soviet response. The invasion went ahead anyway, based on assumptions that Castro's government would collapse and Cubans would spontaneously revolt. Neither happened. Post-invasion inquiries documented the disaster, inadequate planning, poor intelligence, unrealistic assumptions about popular support, an execution that ignored every warning. Kennedy publicly accepted responsibility. Privately, he blamed CIA leadership for forcing him into an operation he'd inherited from Eisenhower's administration. Dulles resigned. The failure strengthened Castro, pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, and set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis 18 months later. The Bay of Pigs became a textbook example of groupthink, wishful analysis, and policy momentum overriding skeptical assessment. In CIA training camps in Guatemala, the Exile Brigade prepared for an operation whose failure was evident to anyone examining the plan objectively. The operation proceeded because stopping it seemed worse than trying and failing. The trying happened. The failure was complete. The lessons were studied and then apparently forgotten in future operations, based on similarly optimistic assumptions. Beirut, October 1983. A suicide truck bomb destroyed the U.S. Marine Corps barracks, killing 241 American service members. The Marines were in Lebanon as part of a multinational peacekeeping force during the country's civil war. The bombing followed warnings that the Marine position was vulnerable, that mission objectives were unclear, and that peacekeepers had become targets for factions viewing American presence as intervention favoring Israel. A Marine colonel had requested permission to establish defensive perimeter and fortifications. The requests were partially denied to avoid appearing militarily aggressive. The suicide bomber drove through minimal security barriers into the barracks compound. The explosion was one of the largest non-nuclear blasts ever recorded. A simultaneous attack killed 58 French paratroopers. The Presidential Commission investigating the bombing found failures in intelligence, security, and command structure. President Reagan initially vowed the Marines would remain, then quietly ordered withdrawal 4 months later. The peacekeeping mission ended without achieving stated objectives. The withdrawal signaled that spectacular violence could drive American forces from commitments. Lebanon descended into years of continued civil war and Syrian occupation. The bombing changed U.S. approach to Middle East interventions. Future operations emphasized force protection and overwhelming firepower over peacekeeping presence. In Beirut's rubble, the barracks bombing became a case study in mission creep, unclear objectives, and vulnerability of forces deployed without adequate security or coherent strategy. The warning signs had existed. The attack happened anyway. The response was withdrawal disguised as redeployment. Mogadishu, October 1993. U.S. Army Rangers and Delta Force operators attempted to capture lieutenants of warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid in a daylight raid. The mission went catastrophically wrong. Helicopters were shot down, ground forces were pinned in urban combat, and the battle lasted 18 hours. 18 American soldiers died, over 70 were wounded, and one pilot's body was dragged through Mogadishu's streets in images broadcast globally. General William Garrison commanded the operation, later testifying to Congress that mission parameters had expanded beyond the original humanitarian intervention to nation-building and warlord hunting, without adequate forces or support. The Somalia deployment had begun in 1992 as food aid protection during famine. It transformed into manhunt and attempted political restructuring. The mission creep was documented. Each escalation justified by previous failure to achieve objectives that kept expanding. The Black Hawk Down battle shocked American public and political leaders. President Clinton ordered withdrawal within 6 months. The humanitarian intervention ended in military defeat and strategic retreat. Somalia continued its civil war for decades without resolution. The Mogadishu experience shaped future interventions. Rwanda genocide occurred months later with U.S. refusing intervention, explicitly citing Somalia as reason for non-involvement. In Pentagon After Action reviews, Somalia became cautionary tale about mission objectives, force structure, and knowing when objectives aren't achievable with allocated resources. The warnings about mission expansion had come from military commanders. The expansion continued. The reckoning came in Mogadishu's streets when theory met reality. Baghdad, March 2003. The United States invaded Iraq based on intelligence assessments that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed imminent threat. The invasion succeeded militarily. Baghdad fell within weeks. The intelligence was wrong. Extensive searches found no active WMD programs, no stockpiles, and no imminent threat. CIA Director George Tenet had called the WMD case a slam dunk. UN weapons inspectors before the invasion had urged more time, finding no evidence of active programs. Their assessments were dismissed as naive or compromised. Secretary of State Colin Powell's UN presentation, built on intelligence later proven false, became symbol of the justification's collapse. The invasion's aftermath, sectarian civil war, Iraqi casualties in hundreds of thousands, regional destabilization, and rise of extremist groups vindicated warnings that regime change without occupation planning would create chaos. Congressional investigations and intelligence reviews documented how certainty about WMDs was constructed from ambiguous evidence, dissenting analysis was suppressed, and policy preferences shaped intelligence conclusions rather than the reverse. No senior officials faced accountability for the intelligence failure. The war continued for 8 years under occupation, then resumed in different form when ISIS emerged from Iraq's instability. In White House Situation Rooms, the decision to invade was presented as necessity based on urgent threat. In Baghdad's abandoned laboratories and empty bunkers, inspectors found programs that had ended years earlier. The gap between justification and reality was never reconciled. The invasion happened anyway, proving that momentum and political will could override contradictory evidence until reality became undeniable. Benghazi, Libya, 2011. NATO intervention, led by U.S. air power, supported rebels overthrowing Muammar Gaddafi's dictatorship. The operation was framed as humanitarian protection during civil war. Gaddafi was captured and killed by rebels. The regime fell. Libya descended into failed state chaos, with competing governments, militia rule, and later becoming a staging ground for terrorist groups and human trafficking networks. U.S. Ambassador Christopher Stevens was killed in Benghazi in September 2012 when militants attacked the diplomatic compound. Senate investigations documented the intervention's lack of planning for post-Gaddafi Libya. The Obama administration's assumption that Libyans would establish stable democracy after 42 years of dictatorship proved wishful thinking. The intervention succeeded in removing Gaddafi. It failed to create anything stable to replace him. Libya became a cautionary tale about regime change without occupation, reconstruction without commitment, and intervention without understanding what comes after. The aftermath included weapons flowing from Libyan arsenals to conflicts across North Africa and Middle East, refugee flows destabilizing Mediterranean region, and ungoverned spaces filled by extremist groups. In Benghazi's diplomatic compound, the consequences of intervention without planning became personally tragic. In Washington's policy debates, Libya became example both sides cited. Interventionists pointed to initial success, skeptics to eventual chaos. The intervention happened. The regime fell. The plan for what came next was improvised poorly. Damascus, August 2013. Syrian government forces used chemical weapons against civilians in rebel-held areas, killing hundreds. President Obama had previously declared chemical weapons use a red line that would trigger American military response. Evidence of the attack was clear. The response wasn't. Obama sought congressional authorization for strikes. Congress appeared unwilling to grant it. Russia offered diplomatic alternative. Syria would surrender chemical weapons for international destruction. Obama accepted, avoiding military intervention. The red line became symbol of stated threats not enforced, undermining American credibility on deterrence. Congressional authorization debate revealed deep public and political skepticism about Middle East interventions after Iraq and Afghanistan. The chemical weapons deal was partially successful, declared stockpiles were removed, but attacks continued with chlorine and other agents not covered by the agreement. The Assad regime, protected by Russian intervention, survived and eventually reclaimed most territory. The Syrian civil war killed hundreds of thousands and created refugee crisis destabilizing Europe. The debate over whether Obama should have enforced the red line through military action continued long after. Supporters argued he avoided another Middle East quagmire. Critics claimed the retreat emboldened adversaries and abandoned Syrian civilians. In Damascus, the weapons were used. In Washington, the response was negotiated away. The distinction between deterrence and intervention collapsed into ambiguity about American commitments and credibility. White House, September 1974. President Gerald Ford, in office barely a month after Nixon's resignation, issued a full pardon for Richard Nixon, covering all offenses he committed or may have committed during his presidency. The executive proclamation came before any charges were filed, ending any possibility of criminal prosecution for Watergate and related abuses of power. Ford claimed he was healing the nation, preventing a long trial from consuming the country's attention. Critics saw a deal. Nixon resigns. Ford becomes president. Nixon gets pardoned. Ford insisted no such arrangement existed. The pardon's language was sweeping, covering not just known crimes, but anything undiscovered. The political cost was immediate. Ford's approval ratings collapsed, and many historians believe the pardon cost him the 1976 election. Special prosecutor Leon Jaworski had compiled evidence for prosecution. The pardon rendered it moot. Nixon accepted the pardon, which legally implied admission of guilt, but never explicitly acknowledged wrongdoing. He spent his remaining years rebuilding his reputation as elder statesman. The Watergate conspirators went to prison. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and others served time. Nixon played golf. The pardon established precedent for protecting former presidents from accountability. In Ford's Oval Office, the decision was framed as mercy and moving forward. In prosecutors' offices, it looked like justice denied at the highest level. The healing Ford promised never quite happened. The resentment over the pardon lasted decades. Kabul, August 2021. American forces withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years, ending the longest war in U.S. history. The withdrawal became chaos. The Afghan government collapsed faster than predicted. The Taliban seized Kabul before evacuation completed, and desperate scenes at the airport showed Afghans clinging to departing aircraft. 13 U.S. service members died in a suicide bombing during the evacuation. Military commanders testified to Congress that they had recommended maintaining small troop presence to prevent collapse. The recommendation was overruled by political decision to complete withdrawal. The speed of Afghan security forces' collapse surprised military intelligence assessments, though the Afghanistan papers had documented skepticism about those forces' capabilities for years. The evacuation rescued over 100,000 people, but left thousands of Afghan allies behind. The Taliban returned to power, erasing 2 decades of American-backed government and social changes. The withdrawal's execution was widely criticized across political spectrum, too hasty, poorly planned, abandoning commitments, and marred by intelligence failures about the collapse timeline. The war's end brought no victory, no stable Afghanistan, no achieved objectives beyond the original 2001 goal of removing al-Qaeda's safe haven. In Kabul's airport, the final days looked like defeat despite official descriptions as responsible termination of failed policy. The war that began with swift victory ended in chaotic retreat. 20 years, trillions spent, thousands of American lives lost, hundreds of thousands of Afghan casualties, for a result remarkably similar to the situation in 2001, except with Taliban leaders hardened by 2 decades of war against the world's most powerful military. The ending was predictable from the Afghanistan papers' revelations. The execution was worse than predicted. The war happened anyway, continued anyway, and ended exactly as skeptics had warned it would. Washington, December 1992. President George H.W. Bush, weeks from leaving office after losing re-election, pardoned 6 Iran-Contra defendants, including former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, whose trial was scheduled to begin weeks later. The clemency records showed the pardons came as independent counsel Lawrence Walsh was preparing to present evidence that could implicate Bush himself in the scandal. Weinberger's notes documented Bush's presence at meetings where arms for hostages deals were discussed, contradicting Bush's claim he was out of the loop. The pardons effectively ended Walsh's investigation. Bush's statement claimed the prosecutions were criminalization of policy differences, not accountability for lawbreaking. Walsh called it a cover-up, completing itself. The pardons included Duane Claridge, Claire George, Elliot Abrams, and 2 others already convicted. The timing, Christmas Eve, outgoing administration, prosecutor closing in, suggested desperation rather than mercy. No future prosecution was possible. The evidence Walsh had compiled went into archives instead of courtrooms. The Iran-Contra affair involved systematic violation of congressional prohibitions and constitutional processes. The accountability ended with mid-level convictions and top-level pardons. In Bush's final days in office, the pardons were presented as principled stand against prosecutorial overreach. In Walsh's files, they were the final act of obstruction in a scandal built on layers of deception. The investigation ended. The questions didn't. Fort Benning, Georgia, March 1971. Lieutenant William Calley was convicted by military court-martial for his role in the My Lai massacre, where U.S. troops killed hundreds of Vietnamese civilians, elderly men, women, and children, in March 1968. The massacre was covered up for over a year until journalist Seymour Hersh's investigation forced military accountability. Army photographer Ronald Haberle's images documented the aftermath. The question wasn't whether it happened. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was who would be held responsible. 26 officers and soldiers were initially charged. Most charges were dropped. Trials proceeded against a handful. Calley alone was convicted, sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. The sentence was reduced to 20 years, then to 10. President Nixon intervened, moving Calley from prison to house arrest. He served 3.5 years under house arrest before being paroled. Captain Ernest Medina, Calley's commanding officer, was acquitted. Higher-ranking officers faced no criminal consequences. The massacre became symbol of Vietnam War's moral catastrophe, but the accountability was limited to one junior officer, while command structure that created conditions for the massacre remained untouched. In Fort Benning's courtroom, one man was found guilty. In My Lai's fields, hundreds had died under orders from a chain of command that escaped justice. The conviction provided minimal accountability for maximum atrocity. Calley's conviction was controversial. Some saw him as scapegoat for failed policy, others as the only person punished for undeniable war crime. Both perspectives contained truth, neither provided justice matching the crime scope. Langley, Virginia, November 2005. Jose Rodriguez, CIA's operations chief, ordered destruction of videotapes documenting interrogations of terrorism suspects at secret detention sites. The tapes showed waterboarding and other coercive techniques that critics called torture, and that were potentially illegal under domestic and international law. The CIA's Office of General Counsel had advised against destruction, noting the tapes were relevant to multiple investigations and court proceedings. Rodriguez ordered them destroyed anyway, citing security concerns about protecting interrogators' identities. The Justice Department investigation into the destruction concluded in 2010 without charges. Prosecutors found Rodriguez believed he had authority to destroy the tapes, making criminal intent difficult to prove. The evidence elimination prevented full accounting of interrogation practices. What was on the tapes remained partially documented through cables and memos, but the visual record was gone. The destruction occurred as congressional and judicial scrutiny of the program intensified, timing that suggested the content would have been problematic if revealed. Rodriguez later defended his decision in a memoir, arguing the techniques were legal and necessary. The legality remained disputed. The tapes that could have settled questions were ash. In CIA headquarters, the destruction was presented as protecting personnel. In investigators' offices, it looked like destruction of evidence. The act itself, destroying materials relevant to criminal investigations, should have been prosecutable. The investigation concluded it wasn't. The pattern was familiar. Accountability deferred through legal technicalities. Baghdad, September 2007. Blackwater contractors opened fire in Nisr Square, killing 17 Iraqi civilians. The shootings were unprovoked. FBI investigation found no evidence contractors were under attack. But prosecution was complicated by diplomatic security agreements, granting contractors immunity from Iraqi law, and muddled jurisdiction over American contractors abroad. The State Department had relied on Blackwater for diplomatic security, creating dependency that complicated accountability. Initial Iraqi anger demanded justice. U.S. officials promised it. The legal process dragged for years. Federal charges were filed in 2008, dismissed on procedural grounds in 2009, reinstated on appeal, and finally resulted in convictions in 2014, 7 years after the killings. 4 contractors received long sentences. In 2020, President Trump pardoned all 4, calling their prosecution unjust. The pardons outraged Iraqis and reopened wounds about contractor impunity. The Nisour Square massacre became symbol of privatized warfare's accountability gaps. Contractors doing government work, but operating outside military justice system, protected by immunity agreements, and ultimately pardoned when convicted. The families received monetary compensation, but no apology. The State Department ended its contract with Blackwater, which rebranded and continued operations under different names. In Baghdad's Nisour Square, a memorial marked where civilians died. In Washington's legal offices, the jurisdictional complexity provided endless opportunities to avoid accountability. The contractors killed 17 people. They served no time. The immunity wasn't just diplomatic, it was structural. Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, 2000s onward. The naval base became detention center for terrorism suspects captured after 9/11, chosen specifically because military lawyers believed its location outside U.S. territory placed it beyond constitutional protections. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld authorized the facility, arguing detainees were unlawful enemy combatants not entitled to Geneva Convention protections or civilian court trials. Habeas corpus rulings by the Supreme Court repeatedly found detainees had constitutional rights to challenge detention. The government responded by creating military tribunals that provided some process while maintaining indefinite detention framework. Some detainees were released, sent to other countries, sometimes with restrictions, sometimes without evidence they'd committed crimes. Others remained for years, even decades, without trial. The highest profile cases inched through military commission proceedings, plagued by legal challenges, evidence complications from interrogations that might have been torture, and classification issues preventing defendants from seeing evidence against them. By 2020s, dozens remained detained. Some had been cleared for release but couldn't be transferred because no country would accept them. Others faced charges that might never reach trial. The facility became symbol of post-9/11 legal gray zones, where detention could be indefinite, evidence could be classified, and trials could be perpetually pending. Successive presidents promised to close Guantanamo. All failed. Congress blocked transfers, security concerns complicated releases, and the legal framework created by the detention system proved easier to maintain than to dismantle. In Guantanamo's cells, men aged in detention without conviction. In Washington's national security offices, the indefinite became permanent through inertia and political convenience. Justice Department, Washington, 2010s. The Office of Legal Counsel wrote opinions authorizing targeted killing of American citizens suspected of terrorism, including drone strikes without trial. The legal reasoning remained classified for years, revealed partially only through leaks and forced disclosure. The memos justified executive authority to order killings based on imminent threat determination, but kept the definition of imminent and the targeting criteria secret. When Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen and alleged al-Qaeda propagandist, was killed by drone strike in Yemen in 2011, the legal authorization was classified. His 16-year-old son, also American, was killed in a separate strike weeks later. Officials described the son's death as unintended, but provided no accountability or investigation. The legal memos authorizing these operations remained secret until partial disclosure under court order and congressional pressure. Even then, large sections were redacted. The secrecy prevented public debate about whether executive branch could unilaterally decide to kill citizens without judicial process. The Fifth Amendment guarantees due process before depriving citizens of life. The Olk memos redefined due process as internal executive branch deliberation. The targeted killings continued under secret legal framework that authorized presidential kill lists reviewed in weekly meetings. The process was bureaucratized, formal, documented, deliberative, but entirely within executive branch, without independent review. In Justice Department offices, the legal reasoning justified what previous generations would have called assassination. In Yemen's tribal areas, American citizens died on presidential orders, backed by legal opinions most Americans couldn't read. The authorization was law. The law was secret. The accountability was theoretical at best. Washington, 1978. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act created a special court to review and approve domestic surveillance requests, responding to Church Committee revelations of intelligence agency abuses. Senator Edward Kennedy championed the reform, arguing constitutional rights required judicial oversight of government surveillance. The FISA court was supposed to be a meaningful check on executive power. It became rubber stamp. In its first 33 years, the court approved over 33,000 warrant requests and rejected fewer than a dozen. The court operates in secret, its rulings classified, its oversight invisible to public scrutiny. After 9/11, the court approved bulk metadata collection programs that surveilled millions of Americans without individualized warrants. Exactly the abuse FISA was meant to prevent. When Edward Snowden's leaks revealed the scope of surveillance in 2013, the public discovered FISA had authorized programs most Americans would have considered unconstitutional. The court's secret interpretations of law allowed surveillance that public readings of the same statutes would prohibit. The reform created oversight structure that provided legal blessing to activities it was designed to prevent. In federal courthouses' secure floors, FISA judges reviewed applications in closed proceedings. The approval rate suggested review was perfunctory. The oversight existed in form, but not function. Washington, December 1982. Representative Edward Bolin authored amendments prohibiting CIA funding for Nicaraguan Contra forces attempting to overthrow the Sandinista government. The Bolin Amendment passed with bipartisan support, asserting congressional control over covert operations and CIA funding. The restriction lasted until the Reagan administration found workarounds. Selling weapons to Iran and diverting profits to Contras, soliciting funding from foreign governments and private donors, and running operations through National Security Council to avoid CIA restrictions. The amendment demonstrated Congress could prohibit specific covert actions, but struggled to prevent determined executive branch from finding alternative funding and operational mechanisms. When Iran-Contra was exposed, the constitutional crisis centered on whether executive branch could conduct foreign policy Congress had explicitly forbidden. The practical answer was yes, if willing to operate in legal gray areas and accept scandal risk. The Boland Amendment was allowed to lapse in 1986. Contra aid resumed through official channels. The brief prohibition had been circumvented rather than obeyed. In House chambers, the amendment was legislative victory over executive overreach. In White House basement offices, it was obstacle requiring creative solutions. The restriction existed. The operations continued. The gap between law and practice was bridged with legal creativity and operational audacity. Congress, 2006. The Military Commissions Act established procedures for trying terrorism suspects while attempting to ban torture and cruel treatment. Bush administration officials worked with Congress to write the legislation, ensuring it included exceptions and definitions protecting interrogation techniques already in use. The act codified Geneva Convention protections, but allowed the president to interpret what they meant in practice. It prohibited torture as defined by U.S. law, but that definition was narrower than international standards. The legislation was response to Supreme Court ruling that military tribunals at Guantanamo violated both Geneva Conventions and Military Justice Code. Rather than ending the practices the court questioned, the act attempted to make them legal retroactively. The torture ban included broad exceptions for actions authorized by President and approved by Justice Department legal opinions, the same structure that had authorized waterboarding and other techniques. The act was simultaneously reform and ratification. It acknowledged problems while protecting officials who'd committed them and preserving presidential authority to continue similar practices. Congressional debate focused on whether America should torture. The legislation's answer was we don't. We do enhanced interrogation, and the president decides the difference. In House floor debates, members condemned torture while voting for framework that permitted it under different names. The ban existed. The techniques continued with legal cover. The semantics changed. The practices adapted. Washington, 2012. The Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act strengthened safeguards for federal employees reporting misconduct, expanding coverage and remedies after years of employees being fired for exposing wrongdoing. President Obama signed it, proclaiming support for transparency. The act included significant limitation. Intelligence community employees weren't fully covered. For CIA, NSA, and other intelligence agencies, whistleblowing still required reporting through internal channels, the same supervisors and agencies committing potential violations. Edward Snowden's 2013 leaks exposed NSA surveillance programs his superiors had approved and his agency had built. Snowden claimed internal reporting would have been futile and probably resulted in prosecution. His choice, leaked to journalists rather than report internally, resulted in espionage charges and exile. The whistleblower protection that existed for most federal employees didn't extend meaningfully to those most likely to witness classified abuses. The gap was intentional. Intelligence agencies argued security required limiting disclosure pathways. The result was protection for some, prosecution for others, depending on which secrets they exposed. In government offices, the law encouraged reporting misconduct. In intelligence agencies, reporting the wrong misconduct to the wrong people meant career destruction or criminal charges. The protection existed. The incentive remained silence. Congress, September 2001. Days after 9/11 attacks, Congress passed the authorization for use of military force, granting the president authority to use force against those responsible for the attacks. The OMP's language was broad: all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons the president determined were connected to 9/11. It was supposed to authorize action in Afghanistan against al-Qaeda. Instead, it became legal basis for 2 decades of global operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and elsewhere, against organizations that didn't exist in 2001 and in countries unrelated to the original attacks. Successive administrations stretched the OMF to cover ISIS, which split from al-Qaeda and became adversary, operations in Syria against Assad regime, and drone strikes in countries far from any battlefield. Congressional attempts to revise or repeal the OMF faced resistance. No president wanted to give up authority, and Congress couldn't agree on replacement language. The result was permanent war authorization based on attacks from over 2 decades prior, applied to conflicts that bore little resemblance to the original authorization's intent. In Congress, the OMF was emergency response to specific attack. In practice, it became blank check for global military operations with no expiration date. The authorization was meant to be temporary. The war it enabled became permanent. Pentagon, 2010s present. Defense and intelligence budget black programs. Classified projects whose existence and funding levels are secret continue with minimal public oversight. Some budget transparency initiatives forced disclosure of top-line intelligence spending figures, but details of how $90+ billion is spent annually remain classified. Congressional intelligence committees receive classified briefings, but most members of Congress vote on funding without knowing what they're funding. The public gets aggregate numbers without program specifics, costs without accountability, spending without oversight. Classified programs include weapons development, surveillance capabilities, and operational expenses. Some legitimate security concerns, others hiding embarrassing failures or questionable legality. The F-35 fighter program, partially classified, ran massively over budget for years before costs became public. Satellite surveillance programs operated for years before declassification. The Manhattan Project model of secrecy for specific national security needs became permanent state for huge portions of federal spending. Budget transparency was supposed to enable democratic accountability. Classification exempted significant government operations from that accountability. In Armed Services Committee hearings, members debated funding levels for programs they couldn't discuss. The appropriations happened. The oversight was theoretical. The spending remained secret decades after some programs ended. Multiple theaters, 2001 present. The 2001 OMF authorized force against Al-Qaeda and those who harbored them. 20 years later, it authorized operations against groups that didn't exist in 2001, in countries unconnected to 9/11, pursuing objectives unrelated to the original authorization. Legal interpretations stretched associated forces to include organizations several degrees removed from Al-Qaeda, sometimes fighting against Al-Qaeda descendants but still covered by the same authorization. The OMF justified operations in at least 7 countries simultaneously. Congressional efforts to debate new authorization founded on disagreement over scope and unwillingness to limit presidential flexibility. Both parties, when in power, preferred broad executive authority. The result was permanent war authorization that expanded through interpretation rather than legislation. In Office of Legal Counsel memos, each expansion was carefully justified through legal reasoning that connected new conflicts to the 2001 authorization. The elasticity was remarkable. The same law covered hunting bin Laden in Afghanistan and fighting ISIS in Syria. The authorization was meant to be specific. Its interpretation became universal. Congressional abdication of war powers was complete when authorizing specific response to specific attack became blank check for global permanent conflict. Multiple countries. 2010s, 2020s. Drone strikes and special operations raids continued across administrations, operating under legal frameworks that remained partially classified. CIA and Joint Special Operations Command operations killed suspected terrorists in Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, and elsewhere, sometimes with host government cooperation, sometimes without. The targeted killing program, exposed and controversial during Obama administration, continued under Trump and Biden with less public attention. The strikes happened regularly, barely noticed. Civilian casualty estimates varied, government claimed precision, independent monitors documented hundreds of civilian deaths. The gap between official accounts and investigative journalism persisted. Strike authorizations became bureaucratic routine, weekly meetings reviewing kill lists, legal reviews by government lawyers, presidential approval for American citizens. The normalization was complete when extraordinary executive power to order killings without trial became standard operating procedure across multiple administrations. In Yemen's tribal regions, the drone strikes were constant presence. In Washington's secure conference rooms, they were line items in classified briefings. The accountability gap remained, strikes conducted in secret, casualties uncounted or disputed, legal authorization classified. The assassination program that would have shocked previous generations became unremarkable counterterrorism tool. Plus countries. 2020s. U.S. Special Operations Command deployed forces to over 80 countries annually, conducting training missions, advisory roles, and direct action operations. Most deployments received no congressional authorization beyond general military funding and executive authority claims. The operations were low visibility warfare, small teams, partner forces doing the fighting, American involvement deniable or minimal enough to avoid public attention. SOCOM's budget exceeded $13 billion. Its operations spanned the globe. Its accountability was limited to classified congressional briefings most members didn't attend. The public awareness was minimal, occasional news stories about operations gone wrong, but routine activities remained invisible. This was deliberate. Special operations allowed military action without political cost of conventional deployment. Thousands of special operators deployed constantly, engaged in conflicts most Americans didn't know existed, in countries Congress hadn't authorized action against. In 2020s, America was at war in more places than during World War II, but few citizens noticed. The operations were classified. The wars were undeclared. The presence was permanent. Multiple adversaries. 2010s, 2020s. NSA and U.S. Cyber Command conducted offensive operations against adversaries' networks, infrastructure, and capabilities, operating in digital domain where attribution was deliberately obscured. Cyber attacks on Iran's nuclear program, interference with North Korea's missile tests, disruption of Russian military communications. These operations happen with presidential authorization, but public deniability. The attacks existed in legal gray area, not quite acts of war, not exactly peacetime, operating under authorities and rules that remain classified. When adversaries conducted similar operations against U.S. targets, responses were calibrated to avoid escalation while retaliating proportionally. The digital battlefield had no clear rules of engagement, no public debate about thresholds for response, and no transparency about what operations were conducted or authorized. Cyber attacks that could disable power grids or financial systems carried potential for catastrophic damage, but the offensive capabilities developed without public discussion of risks or ethics. The warfare was silent, continuous, and invisible. The escalation risks were real but abstract. In NSA's Fort Meade facilities, cyber operations were daily occurrence. In public discourse, they barely registered. The attribution games allowed maximum aggression with plausible deniability. Everyone knew who was attacking. No one officially acknowledged it. Syria, Somalia, 2020s. U.S. military trained, equipped, and advised Kurdish forces in Syria, Somali government troops, and various allied militias, providing air support and intelligence while letting partner forces conduct ground operations. The model allowed American military presence without American casualties, intervention without invasion, and influence without accountability. When partner forces committed atrocities or abandoned positions, the U.S. could disclaim responsibility while continuing support. The Syrian Kurds were equipped and trained to fight ISIS, then partially abandoned when Turkey, a NATO ally, objected to their presence. The betrayal was strategic calculation. Kurdish forces were useful until they became inconvenient. In Somalia, U.S. advisors and airstrikes supported government forces in endless conflict with al-Shabaab, operations that continued for years with minimal public awareness. The indirect warfare model solved political problem of American casualties while creating moral problem of supporting forces whose actions the U.S. couldn't control and wouldn't be held accountable for. The partner forces fought, American provided enablers. The distance allowed intervention without commitment, support without responsibility. $90+ billion annually. Total intelligence community spending approached $100 billion, more than most countries' entire defense budgets, yet detailed accounting remained classified. The public knew approximate top-line numbers, but not what programs were funded, which operations consumed resources, or whether spending was effective. Congressional oversight existed on paper, intelligence committees received classified briefings, but most senators and representatives voted on funding without specifics. The classification protected legitimate sources and methods, but also shielded failures, waste, and questionable programs from accountability. Journalists occasionally revealed classified program costs after operations ended or leaked, but real-time oversight was impossible when spending details were secret. The scope of hidden spending, nearly $100 billion annually, represented a shadow government budget operating with limited democratic accountability. The spending was authorized. The details were classified. The oversight was theoretical. In intelligence agency headquarters, classified programs operated with funding Congress approved without knowing specifics. The public paid for operations it couldn't know about, conducted by agencies it couldn't oversee, with results it couldn't evaluate. Multiple countries. 2010s, 2020s. Drone strikes and special operations raids continued across administrations, operating under legal frameworks that remained partially classified. CIA and Joint Special Operations Command operations killed suspected terrorists in Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, and elsewhere, sometimes with host government cooperation, sometimes without. The targeted killing program, exposed and controversial during Obama administration, continued under Trump and Biden with less public attention. The strikes happened regularly, barely noticed. Civilian casualty estimates varied, government claimed precision, independent monitors documented hundreds of civilian deaths. The gap between official accounts and investigative journalism persisted. Strike authorizations became bureaucratic routine, weekly meetings reviewing kill lists, legal reviews by government lawyers, presidential approval for American citizens. The normalization was complete when extraordinary executive power to order killings without trial became standard operating procedure across multiple administrations. In Yemen's tribal regions, the drone strikes were constant presence. In Washington's secure conference rooms, they were line items in classified briefings. The accountability gap remained, strikes conducted in secret, casualties uncounted or disputed, legal authorization classified. The assassination program that would have shocked previous generations became unremarkable counterterrorism tool. Executive authority, 2020s. Presidents of both parties expanded war powers through legal interpretation, operational precedent, and congressional deference. Each expansion became baseline for the next, ratcheting executive authority upward regardless of party. Obama expanded drone warfare and targeted killing. Trump loosened engagement rules and increased civilian casualty tolerance. Biden maintained most authorities while changing rhetoric. The pattern was consistent. Presidential power to initiate conflict, conduct operations, and order killings expanded incrementally but never contracted. Congress occasionally debated limits but rarely imposed them, preferring to blame presidents for decisions rather than constraining their options. The constitutional framework, Congress declares war, President commands military, existed in theory but not practice. Presidents initiated conflicts, Congress funded them after the fact, and constitutional war power questions went unresolved for decades. The erosion was bipartisan and incremental. Each small expansion was justified by necessity. The cumulative effect was executive branch that could conduct wars globally, indefinitely, without meaningful congressional check. In White House situation rooms, presidents exercised authorities that would have been unrecognizable to earlier generations. In congressional chambers, debates about war powers happened while funding continued. The constitutional balance eroded not through dramatic seizure, but through quiet accumulation of unchecked precedents.